So there's no denying the power this era has over us. I think it's the first period in U.S. history that actually feels modern to us, which is why, for instance, you won't wander into many dorm rooms in 2017 and find posters of Chuck Berry or, Chubby Checker on the walls. But you will wander into a lot of dorm rooms, if that's your thing, and find countless posters of the Doors and the Grateful Dead and the Beatles and Janis Joplin. The name of this event isn't meant to call everyone on stage a radical so much as it is to suggest how dramatically and radically things have changed in the century just past. We are also fascinated by a time of violent unrest when the nation seemed at war with itself, and Cambridge and Somerville weren't exempt from that unrest. We were ground zero. And that's why our first hour today, which will be followed by a short break, is with historians who provide us context for our event. Charles Sullivan holds an AP in geography from Dartmouth College and a Master's City Planning degree from Harvard University. He's been the executive director of the Cambridge Historical Commission since 1974 and is the co-author of A Photographic History of Cambridge, 1984, Maintaining Your Old House in Cambridge, 1988, and Building Old Cambridge Architecture and Development, 2016. With him is Tim Devon, a Somerville artist and writer whose projects deal with community and self-determination. First part of his 3-book series, Mapping Out Utopia, 70s Boston Area Counterculture, came out in mid-July from Free the Future Press, and it looks at Cambridge countercultural organizations and spaces. He works as a librarian at the Somerville Public Library. Charlie will speak, then Tim, and we're going to try to take some questions afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, Charlie Sullivan and Tim Devon. Charlie Sullivan first.
Well, first thing, if someone from the library is here who could cut the lights down a little bit. I know that's probably a hopeless request, having presented here before, but I think the images would be a little bit more visible. So this is a tough topic to excellent. This is a tough topic to get your hands around as someone interested in history. But a few things struck me right away. This is a college town, so sometimes the line between radicalism and bad behavior, it becomes kind of blurred. There we go. Bad behavior has a long history at Harvard. There was the Bad Butter Rebellion in 1765. There was a famous food fight in University Hall in 1819 that inspired a publication and this illustration, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Civil disturbances in Cambridge for most of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century took the form of spring riots, which were practically institutionalized. Students would come out in May in their blazers and neckties and stand on top of the subway infrastructure and taunt the police. The police would respond, sometimes with tear gas. And in 1932, these two, the image and the story aren't connected. They're separated by 5 years, but in the newspaper story, Harvard students apologize for riot. Send note of deep regret to Cambridge police. Well, this is probably unprecedented. I don't think it happened before, and it probably has never happened since. But this is a civil disturbance. Has no political context whatsoever as far as anyone can discover. At other universities, these were known as panty raids. In Cambridge, they were the spring riot with a capital S and a capital R. The scene in Harvard Square was mellow in the 1950s. Here's Joan Baez behind the kiosk, having an impromptu concert. She used this illustration on the cover of her first album in about 1960. So radicalism in Cambridge has a couple of different roots. Some of them are local and some of them are national and international. Locally, the post-war period was marked by the state's plans to expand the highway system through the metropolitan Boston area. Not only the central artery in Boston, but the inner belt, an inner circumferential roadway that would go through Brookline and Cambridge and Somerville, an extension of Route 2 from Alewife through Porter Square into Somerville and downtown Boston. 93, the Southwest Expressway, the Northeast Expressway, and on and on. In Cambridge, this began in 1949 with the publication of a state highway plan, or 1948. The Cambridge Planning Board supported this. This shows an initial route going up the length of Lee Street from Memorial Drive near the corner of Western Avenue up into Somerville, cutting Cambridge in half. This was swapped out for alternative routes along Prospect Street, along Brookline Street, along Vassar Street. But this directly affected a huge swath of Cambridge and promoted an enormous amount of civil disobedience and public activism. Steve is probably here and will probably tell you about this at much greater length, so I'm not going to talk much about the inner belt. In a slightly more local but even more nationally prominent controversy, when the Metropolitan District Commission announced plans to widen Memorial Drive and construct underpasses at River and Western and JFK Streets, the West Cambridge community rose up in arms. Edward Bernays and John Moot formed the Citizens Emergency Committee to save Memorial Drive. Edward Bernays, who was called the father of American public relations for his work in New York in the 1920s, had retired to Cambridge. He came up with the phrase, "Save the sycamores." The trees along Memorial Drive were actually London plane trees, but that's not very alliterative, so sycamores resonated more, and a lot of people are still confused. But the sycamores / plane trees were eventually saved, but not after other episodes of civil disobedience. This is a mostly Harvard student demonstration blocking Memorial Drive in 1964, being broken up by the MDC police with German shepherds and tear gas. There were other demonstrations on the lawn of the State House, and eventually the MDC backed off and abandoned its plan to touch Memorial Drive. The inner belt protests developed throughout the later 1960s. They were more civil, as far as I can recall, took the form of marches like this on City Hall and on the State House. I'm not aware of any violence connected to the inner belt protests, but there was a great deal of activity and heat generated by that controversy. Then the Vietnam War comes along, and then so now the national and international dimensions of radicalism show up. Protests against the Vietnam War began in 1965. In 1967, students at Harvard began to protest against recruitment by Dow Chemical, had a sit-in at Payne Hall. I think 20 or 30 students were suspended as a result of that, lost their scholarships the next year. There were protests against ROTC. Meanwhile, at MIT, there were violent protests against the war research that was, MIT was deeply involved in all sorts of research for the Defense Department. This is a police action going down, Windsor Street towards Massachusetts Avenue, where the students are on the avenue. The police are running down Windsor Street to break up a student demonstration. There are certainly still people around who remember this. Then the occupation of University Hall in 1969. This was a epochal event at Harvard. President Pusey was notoriously inflexible and resistant to listening to students' demands of any sort. The students, many of them in SDS, Students for Democratic Society, occupied University Hall in April 1969, and the administration compounded the controversy by calling in the police, state police, local police, to forcibly remove the students. But of course, there was not a unanimity of opinion about this, and on the right are some counter-protesters burning SDS, I guess, in effigy in front of University Hall. This was a tumultuous time at Harvard for sure, but it didn't end there. There were all sorts of sources and activities at Harvard that contributed to the movement. The fist that is so familiar now, that was derived from European graphic images from the early 19th century, was put into this form in 1969 during the student strike by Harvey Hacker, an architecture student at the School of Design. And these posters were silk-screened using material that was donated free by merchants in Harvard Square. The students were running an operation on the basement of Robinson Hall, silk screening these on t-shirts and almost any other fabric. The text refers to return Payne Hall scholarship. Those are the students who were penalized for protesting against Dow Chemical in 1967. So in April 1970, a year later, the protest escalated with marches back and forth to Boston, occupation of Harvard Square, rioting, setting fires, trashing storefronts, and the Cambridge police were totally unable to respond to this. And so the city called in 1,000 police. This is on April 18th, 1970. 6,000 marchers come into Cambridge. 1,000 police are mobilized following a rally of 50,000 people on Boston Common. 2,000 National Guard were ordered to stand by. Several hundred injured, and on and on. This certainly made the national news. There was also action against free expression in Cambridge. As mundane as this image is, Hayes Bickford's was a 24/7 cafeteria chain. This main Cambridge store was on Mass Ave at the corner of Holyoke Street, and it was open night and day. And all of us who were here in the 1960s and 70s used this as a cafeteria and a hangout, and to the point that the university, who was the landlord, forced the company to close the store between 4 and 5 a.m. Simply to clear out the students who they thought were plotting against, and they were. I wasn't plotting, but I was just getting coffee and English muffins, but other folks certainly were plotting furiously at Hayes Bickford. But beyond that, it was also an era of alternative press. The Avatar was an early alternative newspaper that was considered by the authorities to be publishing obscene material. And I hope someone here today can tell us exactly what obscene material was that they were publishing. I don't remember. But 18 people were arrested in February of 1968 just for selling the Avatar. And 18 people were arrested and convicted of selling obscene literature in Harvard Square. And then in 1970, Felix's Newsstand, which was in the Art Deco storefront at 1304 Mass Avenue, was evicted because of unhappiness. And the unhappiness that Harvard, again, was the landlord, expressed was about Penthouse and Playboy, but they were also selling the Avatar, the real paper, and all sorts of alternative books and magazines. It's ironic because Felix Karagianis had been arrested in 1926 when an agent of the Boston Watch and Ward Society found him selling copies of H.L. Mencken's magazine, The American Mercury. And so in the 1960s, Felix's nephew Angelo was arrested twice for similar reasons, not so much for obscenity, although that might have been the pretext, but for selling subversive literature. So things went forward at a rapid pace. In the spring of 1970, Harvard commencement was occupied by a group of Riverside neighbors led by Sonda Graham, who is here with the megaphone and also here in the front row at the far end. And if anyone here recognizes themselves in any of these photographs, please let me know, because we would love to know who these individuals are. The protesters are standing on the stage at commencement in Harvard Yard in 1970. They had managed to get inside the yard at the beginning of the festivities, and then took over the proceedings and wouldn't leave until Harvard had agreed to have a serious conversation about its incursions into Riverside. This echoed in local politics well into the 2000s, with continued neighborhood resistance to Harvard expansion in the Riverside neighborhood. Women of the Bread and Roses Collective, a year later, in March of 1971, occupied 888 Memorial Drive, a Harvard building, a former factory near the river. Took it over for a couple of weeks, refused to let Al Vellucci, Mayor Vellucci, into the building, or anyone else, or any other male, I guess, for that matter, to negotiate. This seems innocuous today, but in 1971, the powers that be were totally threatened by these uppity women who took over property and refused to have a rational discussion about events. So even the Radcliffe students that year protested at Harvard commencement by wearing a version of the fist over their academic gowns. 1972, this goes on and on. 1972, radicals attacked the Harvard Center for International Affairs, which was doing war-related research, smashing out windows, setting fires, and the National Guard here is cordoning off Harvard Square, trying to prevent another riot, as had happened in April 1970. But then peace was signed in 1973, and everything was cool after that, right? So this postcard was published about that time. The caption on the back, on the other side, says, "Harvard Square, this is our scene. Try to get in it." But while the international aspects of radicalism in Cambridge, at least the really aggressive, violent acting out, ended pretty much with the signing of peace in Paris in 1973. Local issues continued. The Kennedy Library was initially intended to be sited in Harvard Square on the Charles River. Kennedy, of course, died in 1963, and by 1965 his gravesite in Arlington was being visited by 6 million people a year. Folks in West Cambridge and actually all the neighborhoods around Harvard Square were really concerned that all of those 6 million would make their next stop in Harvard Square, and opposed this, which was a radical move in that Harvard and the Kennedys were used to getting their way and had always gotten their way in almost every venture, but in this case they did not, and as we know, the Kennedy Library is in Dorchester. as where they agreed to move it in 1976. In 1987, and for years on either side of 1987, protests against MIT's expansionary policies in Cambridgeport were, and I'm expecting these folks to all identify themselves here. And then in 1997, the Holmes Block demolition in Central Square. These were kind of echoes, and it's interesting that they took place in years ending in 1987, 1997. The Holmes Block was considered to be excessive gentrification of an authentic neighborhood, and radicals around the world. Somebody I knew in Ireland, son of a friend, was furious at me because we were regulating the demolition of the buildings that preceded the Holmes Block. So even this got international attention. And then the Tasty in 1997, and of course we all know what happened to the Tasty. So these become local issues, but that have echoes with national issues of gentrification and equity and the like. So that's where I'm going to stop, but I'll go back to that food fight of 1819 that inspired a poem that printed out, runs about 40 pages, called The Rebelliad. It was published finally in 1842 after circulating in manuscript since 1819. And I'll just read a piece of this because it resonates with my experience. It's talking about this food fight in the basement of University Hall where the dining hall was, and in the middle of this epic poem, when Nathan threw a piece of bread and hit Abijah on the head, the wrathful freshman in a trice sent back another bigger slice, which being buttered pretty well, made greasy work where'er it fell. And thus arose a fearful battle, the coffee cups and saucers rattle, the bread bowls fly at woeful rate, and break many a learned pate. On either side the boldest close and kick and cuff with furious blows, while others, fearful of their bones, slink out of sight and fight with stones, although they now and then appear and rave heroic, curse and swear, but when the danger comes, quick flee behind a neighboring wall or tree. And that was me in 1970 at those demonstrations in Harvard Square, hiding behind a tree, watching the police charge into Harvard Square again and again. So that's my introduction to radicalism in Cambridge. So, questions now or later? Questions? Comments? People want to identify themselves now? It's safe. Okay.
Tim, coming over and swap out.
Is it on the desktop or should I? What's up? Hey everybody, just give me a second while I get my presentation. I also just want to take a moment looking around the room to say I'm about to tell y'all about the era that you lived through, so sorry about that. And also I want to dedicate this to my son, Mac, who's in the back corner. This is going out to you, buddy. So what I've been doing the last couple of years is looking at 1970s Boston area counterculture. For me, that's sort of an extension of the time period that this is about for some people, but others view it as, the longer 60s. For me, my interest has been more in, sorry, I'm trying to multitask. for me, my interest has been in seeing how these ideas proliferate, where they went, also the spaces that they inhabited, as a way to look at, how we can replicate things today, maybe. So, okay, here we go. Sorry, I'm up and running. So the last couple of years I've been looking at 70s Boston area countercultural sites. I have a book out that just came out about Cambridge. It's part of a 3-part series. Y'all should buy it right now, please. So to gather all this information, what I've been doing is looking at old 70s countercultural directories. So I don't get everything, but I think it's an interesting representation. One of them is the New Women's Survival Guide, which is a 1973 feminist directory. Second one is old issues of Communities Magazine, which is this old kind of hippie publication. And the third one was produced here in Cambridge. It's called Alternative America, which I think he still lives here. Is Richard Gardner here? That would be so cool. Okay, somebody just raise your hand. It'll make me happy. Hooray! Okay, hi, Richard. Anyway, the point is that I gathered all this information, and I just didn't get all of it, but it's representative, I like to think. Boston was one of the major countercultural cities in the 60s and 70s, and Cambridge was sort of a locus of that. Doing my stuff, I found over 350 organizations and spaces. And so there's a few clusters, right? You can see in downtown Boston and in Cambridge. Cambridge had, from what I found at least, roughly 1/3 of all of the countercultural organizations and spaces. And these were, public things. They're not like communes that didn't necessarily list their address. Somerville, which we're also talking about, I think, had 25. So between the two of them, that's like 1/3 of everything that was going on in Boston at the time. What I did was I also told the stories of each of these groups, but I think that what I'm going to talk about today just briefly is stuff in the aggregate. So there are a few clusters, so Harvard Square, Inman Square, Central Square, and then a small cluster in Union Square. And so there were these neighborhoods that just were, conducive to this kind of stuff. Part of that was that rents were cheaper a lot back in the 70s compared to today. And that was for a whole host of reasons. There was white flight, there was deindustrialization of cities, a lot of jobs fleeing, there was the recession. But anyway, the bottom line was that people who ran low-budget countercultural organizations could rent space. So I found a few general themes, and I thought I'd just present 2 of them. One was feminism in Cambridge. So out of all of the feminist spaces and organizations in the Boston area that I found, about half of them were in Cambridge. And there were clusters of them around Inman Square, Central Square, and Harvard Square. So in 1969 there was, and sorry, I know there's some women-centered people here, so I'm going to tell you a story. So in 1969 there was, in Emmanuel College, there was a conference on feminism that really energized the scene, from what I understand. And out of it came a number of organizations, including Bread and Roses, which then went on to found the Women's Center, among other things, a restaurant. There was also a feminist school. And so one component of feminism at the time was this idea that you had physical spaces, so schools and safe spaces. So it's interesting to see that sort of play out in this map. Another one is alternative education organizations and alternative schools. So one aspect of the counterculture was this idea that you could democratize education by having adult schools that were free or low cost, that were taught by maybe non-professionals, maybe people from the community. In addition to that, there were also alternative schools for kids, the idea being that you could sort of like colonize the future by teaching kids alternative values that would then live on. So again, there was certain neighborhoods where this happened, right? And Cambridge was one of them. A lot of the alternative education stuff going on in the early 70s was in Cambridge. And so this is probably an obvious point, right? But like minds kind of cluster together. So like minds here, like minds here. There were certain neighborhoods that just kind of fostered these things. So one interesting way that that played out was that it wasn't just the native counterculturalism. There were some people, you know, that came from other places because the Boston area was this kind of like conducive place. My favorite one is the Fairweather community, which was a small neighborhood-wide commune in North Cambridge that sort of briefly existed. And so they had a number of homes. They're based out of this one, which is, I think, is 95 Fairweather Street. They were involved in the local alternative school. And they actually came from other cities to start this. The idea was that they wanted to start a 30,000 person urban commune with its own infrastructure, with its own schools, with its own exchange system. And they thought that Cambridge was a good place to get that done. And I find that fascinating, that like if you're, you know, like scouting the map of America and Canada for a place to start your 30,000 person commune, you settle on North Cambridge. I think that's great. I'm sorry? Yeah, so, okay, so, sorry, let me just check where I'm at. So yeah, spaces back then were a lot cheaper in general, but beyond that, certain spaces were particularly welcoming. So one type was university and college space. You know, a lot of people were in school, so they got to use the space that their universities made available to them. Another type was church spaces. So this is 1151 Mass Ave, which is just south of Harvard Square. Anybody know what this is used for now? I mean, it's a church, right? But what the office is used for? Yeah. So it's got a bunch of things going on now, and for decades it's been used by countercultural and progressive groups. Back in the 70s it was used by Pequid, which was a sensitivity training organization, and a radical book distribution company called Sanctuary, I think. And so the point that I guess I'm trying to make is that, and so even today, Union United, for instance, in Somerville operates out of a church space. So there are all these spaces that churches want to make available to progressive organizations that are available for cheap or free. The Nave in Somerville operates out for free out of a church space, for instance. And so I'm just trying to labor this point because I feel like there's sort of a anti-religious thing going on in the left right now. Not everybody, but some people. And so if you're out looking for space, maybe contact a church. So the other kind of sort of amenable space that I found were benevolent landlords. So this is 186 Hampshire Street in Inman Square in Cambridge. Am I going over time? Am I doing this? Okay. 186 Hampshire Street, which is in the second generation of benevolent landlords. So in the 60s, I believe, a married couple bought this and made it available below market rent for progressive organizations. There was a feminist credit union, there's a feminist bookstore, a whole bunch of stuff going on. And the owners wanted that to happen there. They made it available to them. Even down to this day, the current generation of this family owns this house and makes it available to progressive organizations. So there are a number of those out there as well, and hey, wouldn't it be nice if you guys owned property and you did that? That would be really cool. Think about it. Unfortunately, a lot of the spaces I found have disappeared. Universities like Harvard have expanded. We saw, Charlie showed us a slide about Harvard's expansion. Every university has expanded since then. BU, BC, Suffolk, they've all eaten up these low-cost spaces. Another thing that's happened is a lot of things have been paved over for parking lots or overpasses, which is super cool, right? And then, of course, there's the one everybody loves to hate, which is condo development. So this is 186 Prospect Street in Cambridge in the 70s. And I just love this slide. So this is Trout Fishing in America, which was a sort of short-lived alternative school. And I'm just going to point out two people. Can you guys see this guy right here? He's got like an on his neck and kind of pose. And then there's this girl who looks a little unhappy. Anyway, so 188 Prospect Street. So this space was in turn a alternative school, Trout Fishing in America. Then it was a cooperative art gallery called People's Gallery, and then it was it was a health food store. It was a health food store that established connections to local farms in an early example of what we now think of as like the local food movement. So cheap space let that happen for years. Now, hey, what do we have? Does anybody live there? No? Okay, if you do, sorry. Anyway, so now it's a multi-million-dollar condo. So that went away, right? So yeah, that sort of points to one fact that, is sort of like the elephant in the room in this conversation, which is, if we're looking at where this stuff went and is it reproducible now, the elephant in the room is how incredibly expensive it is in our fair city, in the metropolitan area, and specifically in Cambridge. So high property values mean that public space is a lot more expensive, so you can't do that. And apartment rentals are a lot more expensive, so you can't really work cheap, lower paying jobs, which is what a lot of progressive organizations tend to pay, is lower salaries. So that's kind of heavy, right? So here's a little fun juxtaposition for us. So this is 14 Park Ave in Somerville, which is literally a 3-minute walk from Davis Square Station in Somerville, which is the sort of like Tony part of Somerville now. Back in the 70s, it was, and it's well over $1 million. It's on this really lush street, has this beautiful, like tree in front of it. Back in the 70s, it was home to a bunch of progressive organizations, one of which was the Recycling Revolutionary Co-op, which was one of the first recycling organizations in the area, if not in the country. Still around today through a few name changes, location changes, organizational changes. It's Earthworm Recycling, which is in East Somerville, if you guys know it, near Broadway Station. Sorry, not Broadway Station, on Broadway near Sullivan Square. So $1 million home now, though. This is 16 Lexington Ave in Cambridge, which is on the west side of Cambridge, right near the Watertown line. Well over $1 million back in the 70s. Actually, back in the late 60s, this was the birthplace of Cell 16, which was a radical militant feminist organization. Right? It's hard to imagine these kinds of organizations affording spaces like this now, right? Especially not this space, right? So I guess, which sort of begs the question is, where are these organizations now? What can they afford now? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, really? Right. Oh, do you live there? That's so cool. So he said that this is. Cool. That's so awesome. Okay, well, you know what? Forget what I said about that one. The silver lining in the cloud. That's great. Sorry. Okay, well. Yeah, so if the strength of 60s and 70s radicalism was its sheer visibility in the city, by ability to rent public spaces, to when you're walking down the street you see something, to be able to go to a lot of meetings, the sense that it like existed physically in the city, then where does that leave us now? Except for 14 Park Ave. So yeah, that's what I got. Thanks everybody.
Just a little while for questions. I actually had a couple questions. Charlie, the activities that you described, especially in the 1960s, incredibly intense and so many people involved. And I'm just wondering, for how long did that fester? I assume that people didn't just sort of shake hands at the end of the protest and go home and say, see you on the street, neighbor. Was there a degree of tension that persisted in Cambridge from hawks and doves or various sides for some time after that?
Well, I think, I'm not sure I understand the question. Maybe somebody in the audience would be better off responding to that. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Yeah.
I was curious whether the tensions that you showed us during, especially the 1960s, sort of festered in Cambridge for a while.
I'm sorry,
Well, it's still festering.
Senator Grant's going to take the question.
It is still festering. The issue of affordable housing in Cambridge is a very hard issue. Cambridge has removed most of its families, and that the Harvard, MIT, BU, Lesley College students have just taken over. Yeah, that's right. So we still have these festering problems that the city council doesn't know how to deal with, really. They're afraid of their constituents because if they try to put affordable housing in Brattle Street, West Cambridge, they will be unelected. So we can't get the kind of policy that we need in order to build the affordable housing. The other thing is Cambridge doesn't have much land left because MIT and Harvard has bought it all. And so we are landlocked. So we try to figure out a way of how we can get some of these buildings of which developers, you can't buy a house under $1 million in Cambridge. You can't buy a barn under $1 million in Cambridge. So it's still festering. It probably will go on for a long time. But one thing I can say is that Cambridge does have a quality of life for those who are still here. And those who have been removed because rent control went out the window, they gain all the benefits of our struggle. Cleaning up the streets, planting trees, renewing our playgrounds. We have beautiful playgrounds, and we got people from everywhere using them. So one tries to say, why did I do that? Because it's not benefiting my community, because it's a whole new community. And so I think it will fester for a long time until we can afford to bring in families again. I live on a street where there's only 2 children. I was one of 11 children, and there was scores of children back in that neighborhood. There was children all over the place. Yeah.
Thank you for answering that. Let me give Tim one question, and then we'll open the floor a little bit.
Okay, I'm finished.
Tim, I was curious as to what you thought was the longest lasting, probably still existing, countercultural spaces in Cambridge and Somerville?
The Women's Center, yeah, right on. So you all are from the Women's Center? Are you all from the Women's Center? Rad.
We're part of the building takeover that led to the
What? That's awesome. That's so cool.
You know, it's in the film, Left on Pearl, and made about that history, said it's the longest community women's center in the country and maybe beyond.
And you all own the space, right? You bought it in the 70s? Yeah. Wow. Did you like raise that? Did you guys pull your money, or did you get donations?
They do the building takeover, the solution to the building takeover was a deal that was proposed to us by a Radcliffe trustee who tried to raise the money for the women's center, though they could pay it, so she put her own money. We distributed that project called Susan Lyman, and that was the deal that ended the occupation of the 8 Memorial Drive. And the buying of the building of the women's center 15 months later, that established the women's center 41. I
We can take an additional question or two for our historians if someone would like a microphone. Any questions for the historians?
Hi, I'm sorry I came in late. In response to Mark's question, one thing that changed in the early 70s was the war ended, the draft ended. And I think that's why you no longer saw riots, I think. I came in late and I did hear Charlie talking about the crackdown on free speech and the arrests of Avatar salespersons, the underground newspaper. I believe that was part of Mayor Dan Hayes' war on hippies, and I don't know if you addressed that, but I didn't arrive until shortly after that in Cambridge, but from what I've read about it, it was an incredible attack on civil liberties, where the mayor was leading police raids into people's homes or communes and speaking out on local TV stations, and it got national coverage. So I wonder if you have any memories or observations of that period.
Yeah, there was one episode where the city tried to shut down a store in Central Square that was selling, I guess, obscene or alternative literature, and they couldn't get the courts to do it, so they dug up the sidewalk in front of the building and prevented people from going in. That was the model sales store in the what's now the dance complex.
We have to remember that in those days, you needed a permit to sell stuff in the street, and you needed a permit for a demonstration. That's one of the gains that were made from the tumult of those days, that in America, or at least in Massachusetts, you don't need permit anymore to do that stuff. So that's why they were able to arrest the people for Avatar, not just that they were selling illegal, they were selling obscene literature, but that they didn't have a permit to do it.
Hi, thank you very much. Charles or Charlie, could you tell us more, if you know, there were probably people like Daniel Ellsberg, I believe, who did live near Harvard Square while he was doing the Pentagon Papers Xeroxing. I'm wondering if you know of other activists, true radicals who've been doing things in Cambridge. I mean, clearly Chomsky and others are here. I don't know how much they influenced what was going on in the student movement per se, but certainly with the war, we did a lot of intellectuals and a lot of people who had come over from Europe, who the blacksmith's house had helped settle here, so there was a radical tradition coming over from Europe. Do you know about that? Is that part of the history that you've been gathering?
It should be part of the history. For sure, Ellsberg lived here at the time of the Pentagon Papers. I can't remember where, but I bet plenty of people in the audience could list famous radicals who lived in Cambridge, and then we can start putting up blue plaques for them. And in fact, I'm serious. I would solicit information about who was here and who lived where, because it is a period that we should commemorate. So we're at the Cambridge Historical Commission. We have a website on the city's webpage and a contact information there. Please get in touch. Any more?
I'm just curious, how much overlap or cooperation was there between some of these groups in Cambridge with others in other parts of the city? And it's especially on my mind because I just went to an event last night in Jamaica Plain with Keep It 100 for Eggleston, which is working right now to try to, reclaim affordable housing in the area and create more. And they showed the history documentary Holding Ground about Roxbury in the 80s. And I'm curious also previously to the 80s, but like with busing and other things in other parts of the city, how much like solidarity work was there or overlap?
Yeah, I really don't know the answer to that question. Anybody here want to speak to that?
There was a Cambridge Penn Union, there were various donations in the city engaged in those questions. There was some of those Penn Union, I think there was a sensibility that we had to get together and fight these things. And there were other organizations as well. Those are probably on my mind. Those are always fraught relationships or complicated relationships, but they're definitely the people who are working on it. This is all the people in the fight around Simplex. That was a long time battle about between developers and community residents. So there were a number of long struggles with complex but important coalitions.
My question is about the sharing economy. A recent Time magazine article has basically an image of the Uber sharing economy model collapsing. This seems to me the era of the Summer of Love had a different kind of sharing economy. Is there anything from that era that we can bring into the current environment, particularly in the idea of communes morphing into co-living situations?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to me, I wasn't alive then, I'm sorry. But it's interesting to me to see like how a lot of these organizations actually did make changes and actually have influenced today's culture in ways that kind of get ignored. So you're talking about like how we can adapt these things in today. What I look at is how amazingly these things have survived to today. It's the idea of local food movement came out of the early 70s. The idea of recycling as a mainstream thing came out of the 70s. Recycling was apparently a super weird thing to do back then. And now, you get your little blue bucket and dutifully you trudge out every Tuesday morning, otherwise you get a ticket. And yeah, I mean, I think that, oh, sorry, you know way more than I do.
I want to answer that because there were institutions supporting that sharing economy. There was a group called Alternative Community Projects that matched people up to find communes. The communes had a network that went to Chelsea to buy food at the market. There was a food co-op, there was a pick-up co-op where people would take turns getting food. It would come over and pick it up. And then Harvest Co-op came out of that. So a lot of and there was the idea of free, the women's school was free. There were these community schools were free for very low cost. That was, again, but they were institutions supporting it. There was a community organization in Boston that supported the Boston Community School. So there's an infrastructure, at least a political, institutional coming together that supported the efforts at communal organizations. And there was an ideology that there should be free. They don't have that ideology anymore, but that was the idea behind free clinics, free press, free newspapers, the newspaper was free, lots of giveaway things. So it's a complicated dance, I think, between the organizations that emerge and the larger structures that help to support them.
I just want to mention that two residents of Cambridge, Ken Williams and Caroline Hunter, were working for the Polaroid Corporation in 1970 when they found out that Polaroid was supplying the South African government with the ID2 photo system for the passbooks. And thus started the boycott of Polaroid and the founding of the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement, which was a real beginner, the real spark plug wide boycott of businesses that were doing business with the South African government. And of course, Caroline went on to be vice principal, I think, of Cambridge Rindge and Latin. And Ken was a fine photographer in his own right. There was an offshoot of PRWM called Panic, of which I was a research associate. And we were concerned with the proliferation of identification cards becoming a standard universal identifier in the 1970s, and that was a big issue in the country because a lot of the federal government was thinking about having a federal ID, and our group was against that. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Ken and Caroline.
He worked in the library.
Yes, he worked in the Cambridge Public Library in the audio-visual division.
Thank you. So last question. Sorry, here. Can you take it after the break? Okay. Here we go.
Hi, tomorrow my son turns 38. He's a graduate of the old Cambridge Baptist Church. The photo you had, 1151. That was a radical basement. It was bombed, we think, maybe by FBI. Probably, I'm not sure about the dates on that. The old Cambridge Baptist Church hosted the Central America Education Fund. It also was a sanctuary church. There were signs out front welcoming people who were fleeing from what we all know now is immigration, et cetera, problems. He learned how to cook. He used power tools. And I think they were one of the first young people's group. It was a co-op. We all participated. That you see now with the little kids walking. They hold on to the little rope. They came down to this library out front here, and they played on the children's. They came here for the children's story hour. But most importantly, connecting to Polaroid, is that the little ones got tickets to the Harvard commencement. I think it was 82 or 83. It was the year that the black students turned their back and wore African clothing at commencement. And the little kids each had a letter, probably as big as your sign. And they stood up on their chairs because they were only less than 3 feet high. And they spelled out divest, Harvard divest. I can't remember what letter my son carried.
We're going to take about a 15 or so minute break. Thank you very much to our historians. There's some snacks out in the hallway. Only water should be brought into the lecture hall. And at the end of that time, could our 1960s participants please come to the stage? T. Grace Atkinson, Bill Cunningham, Lori Hamill, Carol Hill, Sandra Graham, and Ken Reeves. We're going to have some food and come back. And when we come back for questions, keep in mind that if you're not on microphone, then CCTV is not picking you up. So we're going to make sure that we can do that better next round. Thanks. See you back here in 15. First time doing this. Welcome back. One of the reasons I live in Cambridge is because residents here change the world. MIT and Harvard, people are going to change the future as we know it. But we also have in Cambridge and Somerville people who've already changed the world and who do it all the time, actually. I thought it worthwhile to take some time to acknowledge that. And even though some of their first work was 50 years ago, they are still among us, and most are still active, and they have to be, because many of the issues that they faced then are still burning for us today. We have on stage with us T. Grace Atkinson, an early national organization of women leader and founder of the radical splinter group The Feminists, who moved to Cambridge in 1997 to complete her dissertation. She taught as a fellow at Harvard and Tufts before retiring in 2004, and remains active in social justice issues, including the strike at Market Basket, and a recent foray into affordable housing, influencing the city's housing authority to create an emergency category of Section 8 vouchers for people facing immediate displacement by unaffordable rent increases. Bill Cunningham has lived, worked, and raised family in Cambridge since 1961. Starting with a radical rent control campaign in 1968, he's since stayed involved off and on with tenant movements as well as various volunteer grassroots, local, community, and political organizations. Sandra Graham, born and raised in Cambridge, elected to the City Council in 1971, serving 18 years, including as vice mayor. She was elected in 1975 to the Massachusetts General Court as a state rep in the 28th Middlesex District, served 12 years before retiring, and her roles put her in the middle of countless battles over such things as Harvard's encroachment on the neighborhoods around it. She marched on Harvard, fought, and won. Carol Hill shared that fight with Harvard, had plenty of her own over related issues of daycare and gentrification. After refusing to speak in 1985 to a grand jury she felt was a witch hunt for activists, she paid the price. She did around 10 months in jail in New York, where she became an activist behind bars. Lori Hamill grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, entered college at the height of the Vietnam War, which compelled him to organize the University of Utah chapter of Students for a Democratic Society. Turned his activist eye toward business, leading his way with a chain of green health clubs and a series of organizations focused on sustainable commerce, including our own Cambridge Local First, Somerville Local First. And Ken Reeves went from the Detroit of the Detroit Rebellion of 1967, which killed 43 people, caused more than 1,100 injuries, and led to 7,000 arrests, to Cambridge to attend Harvard. Worked as a corporate and consumer attorney before running for city council, where he served 8 consecutive terms, became the first African-American and openly gay mayor in U.S. history. Led numerous local, statewide, and national organizations, and is now co-leader of Cambridge's NAACP chapter. And we have our newest generation of activists also on stage, but I apologize, we're getting to you after. This is just for the first generation. All right. Thank you. We're going to get to them after the break, after the ice cream. But for right now, this is the part that has excited me most about planning this event. This is the crux of the event. This is the part that I was like that I most desperately wanted. And I'm going to come down the table, starting with T. Grace and ending with Ken. And I just want everyone to take a couple of minutes to start off telling us about what stands out to them as the single most important moment or act of the 1960s to you nationally. I just want to know, what is the thing that you and the world should take away from the 1960s? And that's just a conversation starter. T. Grace? Is the microphone... First of all, let's make sure all the microphones are on. Sorry about that.
Is it on?
Yes,
Okay.
Excellent.
Most of my activities from 64 to 97 were in New York City. So,
We can't hear you.
oh, can you hear me now? Better? Okay, I was saying that most of my organizing was done in New York City from 64 to 97 when I came up here. When Mark contacted me, I thought, well, I don't really have anything to say about what was going on in Cambridge and Somerville in the 60s and 70s. I don't know. But I do know something about organizing in this area in, say, the last 5 years. And so I've been thinking about what the differences are and what can be learned from those differences. One big difference in New York, especially in the 60s and 70s, is the density. There's the geographical issue that you're living on top of each other. And while there are unpleasant aspects to that, for organizing, it's great because you can't avoid different issues. Everybody has their own issues, and if you want people to listen to your issues, you have to hear what their issues are, and you gradually you catch on. In the 60s in New York, I came in to New York after reading Simone de Beauvoir, so I was that kind of feminist. But I was at Columbia. The Columbia Uprising was very important in the mid-60s. That was very strong anti-war, very strong black movement there. All of these issues were melded together. They weren't the same issues, but you were all in revolt. So that kind of density and cross-pollination that happens constantly is a big asset to growth and evolution politically. I used to think that, say for example, feminism and our war making, they were separate issues. As you get deeper and deeper into something like feminism, women make up half the population. You're not going to make any change for half the population as long as 25% of your budget goes to war making. You can't make any change actually. With women, it's really stark and right in front of you. You can't avoid it. With maybe a smaller group, you could say, well, maybe we can slip by or we can get some improvements. It takes money. And when all of this money is going to killing people all over the world, a really nice occupation, you're not going to be able to change anything here. So that they're integral to each other. Not because I'm a particularly moral person and don't want to kill people. I see that theoretically. But to really understand that it is your issue if you want change, it's different then. A point was made earlier about after the draft was changed, somehow all of our wars didn't seem of paramount interest. Or in the schools, people's oxes weren't being gored. And it does come down to that. But you have to show people how it's really interconnected, really, practically, day by day, interconnected. I got affected by the development thing here, which was really kind of a shock. I mean, I knew that you didn't get a lease when you came, and that seemed very weird to me. And I looked around for some sort of, like you have all over New York, you know, rent alliances, and they didn't have any in '97. And I thought, gee, that's weird. Oh, well, we don't have problems. Ha ha. Anyway, when developers bought up the house I was at and some others, and they want to double, triple the rent, or else you're out within 30 days. I said, you got the wrong bitch this time. This is just not how it works. What's interesting to me is people were being thrown out of their homes all over Cambridge, in big buildings, and they weren't fighting back. Why? They didn't know each other. The biggest handicap in this area is that New York doesn't have is the fear of strangers. New York is a city of strangers. Here there is a culture where people will live next to somebody for 25 years and never meet them. It's incredible. Incredible. So that has to be broken down because people around here are really easy to organize. I thought, well, maybe they're just different. There is that culture, but in fact, they're wonderful people. And you just have to make the first move. And they're there, and they're hurting too. We're talking about housing. It's a big chunk of your income. It's no joke.
T. Grace, that's, I want to keep it moving a little bit. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that we're just capitalizing on the fact that you're here now. Wherever you were in the 60s or early 70s, if you've got an amazing memory to share, we want to hear that. And the reason you're here is because you've been places, you've met people, you've done things. So if you have a very quick, indelible memory that you'd like to share, break it out now. Otherwise, let's move the microphone down and...
Okay, I just have one. You can't separate it just one particular memory.
True enough.
The only other point I would make here is nobody's mentioned the market basket. That was really important. and it's a whole different group of people. So I hope we can really make better connections here than we have in the past, because that's the key. Okay, thanks.
Hello, can you hear me? My name is Carol Hill. Can you hear me? All right. I work. Oh, close. Hello. I'm Carol Hill. I worked for the city for almost 50 years. I was involved in community activism for almost 50 years also. I was one of the first directors that the city hired to work programs, Department of Human Service. I started the first, me and Joanne Wigfall started the first daycare center. We fought with the city because they wouldn't give us money. They didn't think we should be in the school. The school, we paid taxes for the school. We wanted to use the school. So from 8 to 6 o'clock, we wrote up a proposal and we fought with them to get money. Also, Sandra Graham was helpful in getting money too because she was a representative and she was able to give us money. And this idea was to help the parents, low-income families, who were a lot of families in the community, and to help them thrive, get better jobs, and get better education for their 3-year-old children. While this was going on, of course, we had a very thriving community in Riverside. There were all kind of stores. There was meat stores, grocery stores, hairdressers, drugstores, everything. We had everything. And you didn't have to go to Central Square. It was right up the street. And what finally happened is I noticed that around the 60s, I had a hard time getting apartments. And at the time, we didn't realize what was going on with Harvard. I moved around like 3 different times in that community trying to stay in the community because my mother happened so she owned a house. But there were 8 kids and we were all trying to find a place to live in the community. So what finally happened was that I ended up moving into the Cambridgeport and I wanted to stay in the Riverside area. So I struggled a long time with that and got back into the community. But we used to have, I'm going back and forth when I was young, we used to have the playgrounds, the Hoyt Field used to be flooded over, we used to do ice skating, we had community picnics there, we had all kind of parties, we Know Your Neighborhood, we did Crime Watch, we did a range of things for like the last 40 years. And what started happening is people started disappearing from the Cambridgeport and Riverside because of Harvard, what was going on with Harvard. I also marched with Sandra and MIT. I marched with Sandra and Harvard. So there's a lot of things happening, but the most severe thing that happened to me is I worked along in the community. I knew everybody. I worked in the school. I had 500 kids. I used to send flyers home. So, of course, my fingerprint was on like 500 flyers. Later on, in the 80s, I got a subpoena from the federal government, direct from Meese, who was the Attorney General then in Washington, and came through the FBI court in Boston. And it was a subpoena saying that I was involved in a group, that I was the above group that was supporting the below group, which was a total story. I was a community person just working to support my community and keep people in the community. And as soon as I got the subpoena, I knew that I was going to be a non-collaboration. I knew it was a witch hunt. I was going to not collaborate at all and answer any questions about people in my community. I decided that to tell people in the community, I was a secret grand jury. I wasn't supposed to tell anybody, but I came right out and told people that I was involved in this grand jury. What happened was a lot of people helped me. I started a Carroll Hill Defense Committee. They did a lot of work for me. They raised money to take care of my kids while I went away into jail. I was very fortunate to have several good lawyers. I had like a dream team of lawyers. Even though I had to do 7 months hard time in jail, I did a couple of months going back and forth to grand jury, kept going back and forth to grand jury. And lo and behold, I had Mueller. Mueller was my prosecutor. Unbelievable. And I wrote a letter. I don't have the letter here. I could read it. I wrote a letter to him saying I would not collaborate, but they kept bringing me back and forth to the grand jury. It was really a horrible situation, but I stood my ground. 18 people are in there. You can't have a lawyer in there. You can't ask no questions. And I just told him I would not answer any questions, and I read a statement, and I had the statement at home, so I should have brought the statement. And I said to Mueller, you're just trying to use me to get a better job. And lo and behold, he became the FBI director. And now he's right at the White House, so it's like, he knows my face. I mean, I have a dossier on, I mean, I can laugh now, but while I was in jail, I did a lot of women came in and I kept saying, Cal, how many kilos did you bring into jail? How many kilos did you do? They kept thinking I was a dealer, sold drugs, and I said, no, I'm a political prisoner. And a lot of people couldn't understand what the hell that was. I used to get a lot of mail and money sent to me. The women would be jealous and they started, you know, really getting hostile to me. Why are you getting all this money and all these letters? Every time the mail comes, Carol Hill's getting mail from all over the world. But it was really, I really had a difficult time, but I got through it. I had Counselor Jill Elijah, really good lawyers. I had people who were fighting for me in the street. There's a number of people here who went around, got letters signed. The judge was sick of it. He said, I'm tired of all these letters calling me up to release Carol Hill. So finally, the day came when I got released, but it was really a horrible situation because they threatened my family, all my family. They went to all their jobs. I had several doctors in my family. I had a woman who worked at NASA, was a double doctor. They went and threatened her. They threatened my brother with money. He used drugs, so they threatened to give him money to buy drugs. And nobody would talk anything. Nobody never said anything about me. Sandra can attest, she wrote letters also too to get me out. And 2020 wanted to come in to visit me in jail, but they wouldn't let 2020 come in to interview me at all. While I was in jail, I did suicide watch all the time for girls. They ended up using me because they said, Carol, while you're here, it seems very calm in here. But I used to chant. I chanted all the time. They sent me to Cranston jail, and they put me in a cell where all women had committed murder, so they felt that was going to threaten me to testify. But I ended up being like a therapist with these women, saying, and they all cried when I left. I was very fortunate to get out, and I got out, the day I got out, it was St. Patrick's Day. It was unbelievable. A lot of people from the community came and testified, and the judge was Judge Mazzone. I mean, this is back in the 80s, so you're not familiar. And after my case was, they put up, what do you call it, we walked through. After my case, because of it, they felt that I was part of a terrorist group, and they said that everyone came in and had to go walk through the detector. They put a detector after my case downtown in the federal building. The detector was put in because they felt that they were going to try to, I was going to try to escape, or people were going to try to take me out. But I'm very thankful for what happened, and I'm back to work. They gave me a hard time. The city said, Carol, you know, you were in prison, you know, you can't have your job back. So my counselor and Jill and some lawyers fought for me to get my job back, so I'm still working for the city. And I'm getting my retirement, thank goodness.
I'm Bill Cunningham, and we all actually lived within a few blocks of each other in those days, so just a disclosure there. I'm identified with the housing movement, with the tenant movement, but actually my first solid experience was also a prison experience, because we had the draft in those days and the Vietnam War was coming up. And as I was not a pacifist, I didn't have the option of trying to get out of it by making excuses. So even though by that time I had a family and I was living on Western Avenue, I maybe could have got out of it, but the point was at that time to strike against the war and as visibly as you could, and that was in 1965. So I learned a lot in prison. I met a lot of interesting people there, and it certainly didn't de-radicalize me to be there. It was an experience to be there in the year 1965 when the anti-war movement was becoming massive, and when the Black Liberation Movement was beginning to be born out of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, a couple of more years of relative calm on my front, and some people came to our door with a rent control petition in the fall of 1968. And these people were actually radical students from SDS who would later be involved in the big Harvard strike. But they brought the petition, and so I got involved in this movement to get rent control by getting enough signatures and getting on the ballot. And during that time, we thought if we got enough signatures and get on the ballot, we would win the election and we'd get rent control. But the city simply refused to put the question on the ballot. So we basically attacked the election commission with flying wedges and got 42 people arrested. That same week, I participated in our very first eviction blockade, and that was the thing that changed my view of what could be done the most. That's a radical action. To take, I think, radical action, I think the historical introduction gave you the idea that it's violence equals radical. But definitely, it certainly whetted your appetite for some action. So I'll tell you about how the eviction blockings worked. The way they worked is there were no cell phones in those days. There weren't even beepers. All it was telephones. So we had to set up a rather sophisticated system of a telephone alert. When the moving truck was coming to evict somebody, the calls would be made, and hopefully within 20 minutes there'd be 100 people outside to blockade the eviction. And in those days, the police, of course, were not any more friendly than they are today, but they didn't wear masks, and they weren't ready for this. So sometimes when you'd be blocking an eviction, they would actually go, "We don't want to do this." The first one that I took part in, one of our people actually knocked the constable over on his ass, and the constable goes to a cop, arrest her, you saw what she did, and the cop walks away and says, "We're not going to be a patsy today." So they didn't, so this was a successful tactic, and I think that in the course of 1969 and 1970, with that sort of thing spreading around the state, that's why rent control was in fact passed unexpectedly by the state legislature and signed by a Republican governor. And so rent control became a central issue in Cambridge for the next 25 years. You have to understand that the movement in those days, that when we started an organization called Cambridge Tenants Organizing Committee, the previous speakers pretty much talked about what I'm thinking about. The movement in those days was overlapping. Everything overlapped. All the issues overlapped. So in our office, people would come in. We were fighting the police brutality issue at the very same time. Meetings would take place in our office preparing for that. The people would come in with organizing unions. The food co-ops that were there at that time weren't based mostly in any place. They were neighborhood operation. People would come in, the food co-ops. Ken Williams would come in and prepare for rallies for the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement. We participated in anti-war rallies, and interestingly, you think this is something that I want people to think about. These anti-war demonstrations in those days, nobody trusted the government. So one of the favorite slogans was 2468, organized to smash the state, smash the state. So I see there's still, so you can see, when you think about that people who today are libertarians and people who today are socialists and people of all these different persuasions, that wasn't worked out at that time. It meant young people who had a sort of broad unity that overlapped many of the sharp divisions that we see today, and that we definitely saw when we had rent control, fighting about that. Finally, I want to emphasize that the context in which rent control was won and fought for was the context of university expansion, urban renewal, which wasn't mentioned by the historians, the highway fight and urban renewal. These plans, which were hatched by the government in collaboration with real estate developers, essentially look forward to basically demolishing about a fifth of the working class neighborhoods of Cambridge. Riverside, 1/5 of Riverside, 1/5 of Donnelly Field, and the resistance to that, and the tension that was created around the country by urban renewal dislocating literally millions of people, This led to the insurrections of the late 60s, and called the Black Riots. These insurrections were not just things that came out of nowhere. They came from people who were being relocated over and over again and pushed into unfamiliar neighborhoods, the deindustrialization that was going on, the war, you have to understand it today, and remember, for those who were there, recall how everything was coming apart at once from the perspective of the government. So out of the black liberation movement arose the female liberation movement, and then the gay liberation movement. Gay liberation, imagine something that wasn't even on the radar, anybody's political radar a few years earlier. After a while, the radical has become mainstream. It's now very difficult to attack these gains. These cultural gains have been the ones that have been the most solid. As for rent control, it came and went, but it was part of what saved us from the physical demolition of our neighborhoods. Since industry left and since the developers kept pushing, unfortunately, there's a downside, which is many of these houses that were labeled as blight and targeted for demolition when they had poor and working people in them are now worth $1 million, $2 million, and people who can afford those prices are the people who live in them now. So as has been mentioned by others, we basically saved the city for other people. Right. Let's hope that those other people are slightly grateful for this. But, you know, in the long run, the transformations, I think, that we see in front of us that seem so huge and overwhelming, they're not going to last either. I mean, our time came and went. That time will too. The biotech industry, Harvard and MIT that are so mighty today, China, India, Malaysia, those countries are going to build their own infrastructure. They're going to have their own high-tech system built up, and they will no longer have to come to MIT to learn. They'll no longer have to come to Kendall Square to do biotech. And then the tide will start coming in, and it will come into the places where those labs are being built. Think about it. Okay.
I like to stand because I'm short. You know, sometimes you really don't know how to begin the story because you really don't know how it started. And I was born and raised in Cambridge all my life, my family. I'm one of 11 children. And in 1963, we had a poverty program called the Cambridge Economic Opportunity Program, which was funded by the government to help communities plan their community. And I was asked to be the president of that. And I said, well, how much time does it take? Because I have 5 kids. And they said, oh, Sandra, just once a month. Well, once a month became twice a month, became 3 times a month. And before I knew it, I was always in a meeting. And so while I was the president of that organization, I went around and I started talking to my community. And I found out that the most urgent problem was evictions. People were being evicted. Harvard was buying all the property, evicting the tenants. And so we said we had to do something about it. And, you know, I thought, how the hell do you fight Harvard with all its millions of dollars? How do you, and all their big famous lawyers, how do you fight them? And so we decided that we was going to march on Harvard. Mrs. Pusey, who was President Pusey's wife, was on the board of our settlement house, which is right in our community. So we used to have meetings there, but we would keep them quiet because we knew she was there. So we sent a letter to Harvard, to the board of directors, and we said we wanted to meet with them. No response. We waited for a couple of weeks, no response. So we said we had to do something to get their attention. So the night before, Mrs. Pusey is in the kitchen with us making tuna fish sandwiches for the families who were going to walk to Harvard. It was so funny. I'm sorry. I had to laugh. She was making those tuna fish sandwiches, and she didn't know that we was marching on Harvard. And that was for the people who marched on Harvard. But anyways, because the pressure was so great on our community, I was involved with Bill, and I was involved with Carol, and I'm not going to repeat what they said because everything they said was true. So I joined with them to try to protect our community, and we did the petition for rent control. But going back to Harvard, they didn't respond, so we had 350 community people march on Harvard on June 10th of 1970. We got up there and we said we was going to stay until we got a response. And so nobody would respond to us. So we sat in Harvard Yard and we stayed there. And so we spent the night. And the Harvard student says, come on, sleep in our dorm. We said, no, we're going to sleep right here on the ground. And we had our kids and we slept on the ground. In the early morning, Mayor Alfred Bellucci at the time came and told us to get the hell out. I said, who the hell do you think you're talking to? Who do you think you're well, you need to get out of here. This is Harvard's graduation. Get out. You know what it is. So anyways, we stayed. And around 10 o'clock, a group of students who were graduating had a sign that said, Harvard out of Riverside. And they were protesting the Vietnam War. And so they took off their robes and they said, come on in. And we got into the line of procession and we marched in the line. Harvard didn't know any better. We marched in the line and we got 4 rows from the stage. And so we're sitting there and I'm saying, well, what is our next step? We didn't have this planned. We did not plan this. So we said, what is the next step? So this guy who was a student, his name was Stephen Kelman, he comes on and he talks about the oppressed people of the world. I said, well, the hell with that, because here we are. He don't have to talk about oppressed people of the world. Here we are. And so we jumped over the rows of the seats and got up on the stage. And I grabbed the mic and I started talking about the oppression in Riverside and how Harvard was buying our houses and putting our people out. And I kept talking, and then the president, Piercy, he comes over and says, get off the mic. I said, I'm not getting off of anything. He said, get off the mic. I said, no. So he went over and he shut off the mic. So I had my friends who had a bullhorn, and I took that bullhorn and I told them exactly what was going on, and I didn't care if they threw me off of that stage. So what they did was they called the black officers and told them, you need to get her off the stage. But the black officers said, hell no, I ain't touching her. So we took over the stage for about 20 or 30 minutes. And I absolutely demanded that the directors meet with me now. I know you're here because it's graduation, so you meet with me now. And so they kind of thought it over, and I guess they must have talked to each other. But 4 of them came. 4 of them came. We went into one of the halls and we sat down and we discussed housing and how Harvard could build more housing for our community since they were taking it away. And so for 4 hours we were in there negotiating. Meanwhile, the Vietnam movement, they took over the stage after I left the stage. So it was a great day. It was a great day. So we discussed that, and then we had to work with Harvard to produce some housing, some land that they gave us to build some housing on. But when we asked for, it was called tree land, right on the river. It's on the corner of Weston and Memorial Drive. There was a nursery, a plant nursery there. So we said we wanted that land to build affordable housing on it. And the man, he looked at me and he kept looking at me. He says, that land is too valuable for low-income people. I said, well, who's low income? You think I'm low income because I'm black? Well, I was low income. But how dare you think I was low income because I'm black? You know, so anyways, we finished the conversation and we went home after that. But we still are in a struggle. There's no end to what Harvard does. They were giving out 100% mortgages with no interest to the professors that they wanted to come into the city. And so they would scout around in our neighborhoods and they would buy these houses. And I was saying, who's buying all these houses? Come to find out, Harvard had president and fellows. That was the real estate agent. So I couldn't figure out who was buying the houses because it was all under president and fellows. Yeah, and they used straws. But we had some good students at Harvard who gave us a list of who they were. The students were fabulous to us. They really supported us. They gave us the information that we needed, and we worked with them, and we worked with them on their issues when they took over their administrative building. It was really good because the students were involved. Today, they're not involved. And today, we cleaned up our community. We put trees, we cleaned the streets, new playgrounds, everything. For who? For the gentrifiers. Those who came in and bought the houses at a cheap price back then. I bought my house in 1975 for $25,000. It is worth now $2.5 million if I was to sell it. So the neighborhood is gone because most of them only stay for 2 years to get their master's or PhD, and then they're gone. So you never know who's living next to you. They don't come out to any meetings at the community center. You know, they only come out when it's in their best interest. They fought us at the brand new school that we just built on Putnam, and they didn't want us to they didn't want us to tear down because Kurt Jackson, who is some architect. I said, who the hell is Kurt Jackson? So anyways, we still have our battles. We've won some and we've lost a lot. But we're going to continue to fight to keep whatever we have there. And that is my story, and I'm telling you, we lived in the best of times. We enjoyed what we did. We were committed, and we were specific about what we wanted, and we worked on it until we could get it. And you know, after rent control left, then there was no control. And then families had to move out because of the high rents. The developers came in, chewed up the housing. There is no three-family housing in Cambridge. No three-bedroom apartments in Cambridge. None. They're all lofts, studios, one-bedroom, two-bedroom. So even if you have 2 kids and it's a boy and a girl, and you need a 3-bedroom, you can't find it in Cambridge. You can't find it. But hopefully, we'll get a city council with some guts that will help us with the affordable housing issue in the future. And hopefully, we could bring some families back to Cambridge.
Thank you for giving such an inspiring and eloquent speech and making it so difficult for me to follow you, but I'll do the best I can. No excuses. Okay. I just want to say that I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, that he mentioned, with my good friend Tim Plank. And I got involved in this movement because of 3 basic issues, which is economic inequity, racism, and the war. And I also agree with what you said, that all of these things are connected. But those are the three things that really motivated me back in the 60s. And so I was actually an Eagle Scout, and I wanted to go to the SDS convention in Chicago in 1969, so I thought I'd put on my Eagle Scout outfit, and I hitchhiked from Salt Lake City out to Chicago. And there wasn't that many radicals in Utah at that time, as you might imagine. So I ended up walking into the SDS convention, which was the one where the Weathermen were formed, and it was all this big split and all this craziness. But I ended up meeting some people who invited me to Boston, Cambridge, to find out more about the movement. And so I hitchhiked from Chicago over to Cambridge, and ended up, somebody dropped me off in Central Square, and I remember going on, they actually had a grocery store there. It wasn't Harvest at that time where I was. Brought some watermelon, sat down, started eating. It was like 100 degrees outside, and trying to figure out how I was going to get to where I was going to stay that night. Anyway, Cambridge at that time, in the summer of '69, it was right after the strike at Harvard. And everywhere I turned, it seemed like there was every single person in the whole city was a radical. Of course, that's coming from somebody who lived in Salt Lake City, right? But honest to God, there was so many radicals and so many stripes and so many different demonstrations, and it seemed like you couldn't go anywhere. In fact, I was in that summer, I worked at the Necco Candy Factory in Central Square, making Necco wafers and Rolos, which I'm very proud of. And I'm not a big candy eater, but I'm pretty loyal to my Necco wafers and Rolos, and making $1.10 an hour. But I also went canvassing with a guy named Ron Stoyan for rent control, and trying to explain to people the importance of rent control, and talking to people about this looming Harvard takeover of the city. And at the time, I wasn't actually positive that it was true, because I didn't know much, but 45 years later or whatever, almost 50 years later, it was true. Now, they were taking over the city, as was MIT, and that created a lot of problems. But I do want to say that the one organization that was not mentioned, that was in a certain sense countercultural, but also very radical. Does anybody know what the first office workers organization was in the whole nation, where that was? No, that's before 95. This is the one that led to 9 to 5. Does anybody know? Harvard Clerical Workers. And I was, pardon me? Yeah, I was actually one of the founders of that organization, because I worked at the registrar's office as a clerk typist. And I was one of 2 guys with about 38 women and me and one other guy founding this organization, which became a clerical workers union. Boy, they were petrified by the idea of having a union among their clerical workers. And that did lead to 9 to 5. And one of the founders of that was a woman named Karen Nussbaum, who was also, and she ended up becoming the Deputy Secretary of Women for the Department of Labor under Robert Reich. But in any case, I was involved in that as well, and that was pretty exciting, being, and being, just so you're clear, as a male with 38 women, I was pretty subtly sort of quiet. I just want you to know that. I was just trying to go along and try to occasionally make my points, but I knew where I was and who I was at that point. Even though my name is Laurie, it's sort of a girl's name, but I'm a guy, so it didn't quite. So anyway, that's the deal. So, at any rate, so that then what I just wanted to go over real quick here is that the 2 most depressing days of the 21st century for me as a human being was 9/11, which completely depressed me, but far beyond that was 11/9, right, the day after the presidential election. And I can tell you that I wasn't the only one, because if you walked down the streets of Cambridge, there was nobody on the streets. Everybody was either never afraid to get up, drunk, stoned, out of their minds, or protesting something. There was nobody doing any business on that day, because we were all so depressed with what actually happened. I mean, I couldn't believe that actually would happen. So that was a traumatic experience for all the people that I've been spending my life since 2002 working to organize small, local, independent businesses that care about the community. That's what I've been spending my life doing, and one of the groups I organized was Cambridge Local First, along with 40 other groups around the country, and founded a couple of national organizations. I was a national officer in Students for Democratic Society, and the things I learned in that I just keep using, and founded 3 other national organizations that are out there organizing businesses, national businesses, local businesses with community groups all around the country. In any case, so the thing I had to try to deal with was how do I deal with this depression? Because I could never believe that even close to a majority of the people could vote for who got elected. And then I started realizing, I started comparing the time of the 60s with the time of where we are now, and I realized that in almost every case, it was way, way worse in the 60s. When it comes to racism and civil rights, not even close today versus the 60s. I mean, the idea of an African-American president being elected in the 60s was not even a possibility. So even though there's humongous issues of racism still to this day, that's a huge issue for me in my life and will always be. Back in those days, it was churches getting bombed. I mean, it was unbelievably how bad the racism was and the prejudice that was available, it existed, institutional racism that existed in the 60s. The war in Vietnam was the worst war we've ever been involved with, in my opinion, by far. And I just heard a couple stories on NPR which just demonstrated more and more of how unbelievably painful and horrendous that war was. That's what really generated so much of my generation's and our generation's activity, was that war. And when it comes to economic inequality, I think that's one area where we're actually worse, where things are, the division between rich and poor is even worse now. But overall, I think things are a lot better. So, and I realized how happy, as you mentioned, what a happy and joyous time it was, because we were feeling so oppressed that to get together with people who were trying to change the world was very liberating and unbelievably beautiful. And so for me, what I'm trying to, and I've seen this happen, I've seen people come out of their shells and get involved in so many ways because of what happened in this election. So I feel like if we can have the same context and the same conversations about how we can actually come together to find ways to fight the ways that ourselves and people everywhere in this world are being oppressed, that I think it's an unbelievable opportunity, and that's why I feel such a connection with the millennials. I give the millennials huge credit, and I'm not huge fans of the political perspective of the two previous generations between the baby boomers and the millennials, but you got to give the millennials credit because they did something. Big hand for the millennials. I'm a huge fan of millennials because before Bernie Sanders and that movement started, any place you talked to, the word socialist was like worse than being called a Nazi. And they made it okay where nobody's like bad-mouthing a socialist these days. I mean, even the really ridiculous right-wingers are saying that, Bernie Sanders has got a good point, And so, for me, I just like to have us reflect on, where we were in the 60s and where we are now. And what I tell people is, today I'm 69 years old, but I'm just getting started, so watch out.
So I'm going to attempt to answer your question, which was what singular event of the 60s sort of brought it all home for me. And what immediately flashed in my mind was assassination of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Kennedys. That rocked that decade and sent tremors through. I mean, think of your president being assassinated. We can't figure out by who, but he's dead. And the world order as we knew it just shook. And think about all the hope for Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement suddenly being dead. So this caused a generation to be really shaken. And I think out of that state came many things. So, I'm a Canterbridger and I've lived here more of my life than anywhere else, but actually I'm from Detroit. So I've just come back from Detroit last week, where in Detroit they are involved in looking backward to look forward. It is the 50th anniversary of the 1967 riots. In 1967, I was a 17-year-old living 3 blocks from where the riots started. So there are a lot of things I don't know about, but I know about the riots in Detroit. So the fact of the matter is, I came here to go to Harvard in '68, but the experience of those riots down my block were part of what I brought with me. And further, my parents are Jamaican immigrants. So Jamaican, particularly men, are very political. We like rum, and we like to discuss politics. And so my I'm the creature of my uncles and my grandfathers because I sat through so many of their discussions, but it was always clear to me that politics was important, and it was clear to me in Detroit. Detroit is a very special place because I grew up in a city where the black people were very empowered because so many people had jobs in the auto plants, and many of my friends, their mom was a teacher, and that combination gave you a stability. And so I had this stability in America, and also some very good upper middle class black friends who explained to me that you are not inferior to white people. Not at all. These Polish people, they barbecue on the front lawn. We wouldn't do that. So these were the messages that I arrived here with of not inferiority. And I thank God for the Detroit of then. So I get to Harvard, and I'm at Harvard at a very unusual time. They never had a critical mass of black people there until my group came. So suddenly there's 100 black people wandering around Harvard as undergraduates. They have no clue what to do with us. But they were very insidious. So people said in my crew said, well, we'd like to study African American studies. And they said, African American studies? What would you study? You could cobble together maybe a little sociology, a little history, poetry, and this is at a place that has a department of folklore and mythology. But they're going to say, so bringing the notion that we had a value, thank God for knowing I wasn't inferior to white people, because trust me, I was thrust into an oven that was hot. And I also learned that being an old white guy who was allegedly smart was a mythology too, because these are the deans and presidents of Harvard are telling you you're not worth the study. So to have lived long enough to see that the Department of African American Studies at Harvard is the premier one in the world. And if you talk about Harvard, you can talk about that department today. So I feel I have arrived because I came, it was a desert. So while I was there, some friend of mine here says to me, well, I didn't know you were a radical. I'm thinking to myself, well, you don't know anything about me, so I don't know. But my point is, so you get to Harvard, and Harvard is got all this investment in South Africa. And we as students, we want not to be connected to that at all. Divest. As long as we're here, don't do that in our name. So, Black Student Union of that time, I mean, there was nothing. So we built the Black Student Union. I'm an original Kumba singer. I mean, we had to put in the template because it was not here. So we decide what we're going to do is we're going to take over the president's office, Mass Hall in the middle of Harvard Yard. And we band together and see, this is where it helps to know who you are, because, you know, if 50 of us went to break in, 20 of us went in. I don't know what happened to the other people. But my point is, so we went early in the morning, we broke the window, here come the black security guards. We tell them, go out the front door, get out. And we were in that building for 2 weeks. And it's the largest demonstration ever was at Harvard. People came from all the other schools and marched around the yard so that the police wouldn't come in and get us, because in '69, when they took over University Hall, they waited till night and went in and took the students out. So that didn't happen to us. And we did prompt the notion that divestment was real and we were serious. So those are things that I think are worth remembering. Now, with respect to Cambridge and radicalism, I can just tell you, you know, we discussed rent control in Cambridge as if it was like a given. In the context of America and capitalism, to have been able to have a system that regulated privately owned real estate, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And we kept it, and Brookline kept it. Somerville had it, and they voted it out. But I was proud of that. I kind of, believe it or not, came up in the tenants movement, and I was the president of my building association, and it was a struggle in Cambridge then, but at that time, and when I was first elected in Cambridge, 70% of the electorate was tenants. And at my initial city council, I was the only tenant. And it was just odd. That was odd. So I'm going to try to get back to your question. There's something T. Grace said about how we in Cambridge don't know each other. There's a very accomplished professor at MIT, and some of you know I've been a visiting scholar at MIT in urban studies and planning. And in that department is a professor named Tunny Lee, who was at one time the head of planning for the city of Boston. So I meet him, and he's the most interesting man you can imagine. And I say, well, where do you live? He says, I live in Cambridge. I said, oh, where? He says, at 321 Harvard Street. I said, that's interesting. I live at 341 Harvard Street. I lived there almost 20-something years. I never seen you. He says, Ken, this is a rich neighborhood. Rich people don't need each other. That's why they don't know each other. And I thought, you know, Tony Lee, he's in his 90s, but I think he put his finger on it. Last but not least, I'll just say this. As someone who's spent a lot of their life in politics in the place, I'm proud of where Cambridge has come. When I sit in this auditorium, we used to have a little dank corner in our library for a lecture hall. And this didn't just fall out the sky. Black Brain worked on this very hard to be sure that we could have a decent lecture hall in our new library that the neighbors did not want. But we persevered. So when you go out this building today, look around you. This is probably the most perfect building in America. It's happy. Everybody is here from here, thither, and yon, and they're all progressing. Because the basis of democracy is free public education and free libraries. So I want to thank my trustee, Janet Axelrod, for getting us here. And we will survive this MF Trump. We will. We will. We will.
Yes, we will.
So I have questions, but a lot of that actually covered in various ways some questions I had, so it's a little confusing, like which one I would ask everyone. So I think that for the remaining time, I'm going to cede my time, and let's have questions from the audience. Just 1 second. Let's get someone up here to handle the microphone. How about this?
Hi, my name is Aisha. I'm a rising junior at Mount Holyoke, and I've lived in Cambridge since I was 7 years old. I am not part of the sort of gentrifying wave. My parents own a small business here in Cambridge. They own the Village Kitchen. And as someone who comes from a middle-class family, I do feel as if I'm one of the affected people really by the housing crisis. And the thing is like I love this city, but I feel like I don't know where my future is because housing is so expensive and it's so hard to find a job. And so even though like I have like brilliant grades, I go to like one of the top colleges, but it's hard for me to see an opportunity. And also I'm an activist. I do activism with a lot of different organizations in Cambridge. So I guess my question is like, what's your advice to sort of young, sort of, like brilliant activists, who are going to college and who are doing these amazing things, but don't quite see where their space is going to be after college? What's your advice to them? Also, I want to say like thank you because a lot of your stories about like housing really like, and about like Cambridge like just really like hit me in my heart. So thank you.
Thank you for the question. But your question is like all of the other kids' questions in the city. I think that if you're going to be an activist, that you must stay fully aware of what the issues are. And then you must talk to them, like go to the city council, go to the school committee, bring the issues before them, find out what the problem is. You've got to be committed and you've got to be specific on your issues. So if you, I mean, jobs, jobs are hard to find, at least in this era, because you can't even get a personal interview. You have to go online to fill out a resume or whatever you have to do, and then they don't even call you back. So it's really hard to get a job. But let me tell you, if you are active in your community, people will know who you are and they'll come to you. Because I didn't know anybody, but they knew me because I was active. And people knew what I was about. So they came to me. And that's the only way that people knew me, was through my activism, through going to city council meetings, through going to school committee meetings, being in meetings, redesigning a new school. All of that stuff helps. It helps you. And sooner or later, you will get a job because people will know who you are and what you can do. So I would suggest that if you're active, that you become much more vocal and more visible, and people will know who you are.
Let me just add to that, I think getting a job is your least difficult situation. Getting a good job is really, that's well paid. And right now, the city of Cambridge, like many business districts around this country, are under a major assault by these huge corporations that are buying up huge swaths of real estate and kicking out small businesses. And if you picture Cambridge without small businesses, it's not a pretty place. So if all you see is banks and all you see is chain stores, that's not a pretty picture. So we're a bunch of us, a number of us in the city of Cambridge are working together with many city councilors to find ways to make sure that just as it's important to have affordable housing, which we need more affordable housing because most people who work in Cambridge can't live in Cambridge because they can't afford it. So we need affordable housing, and that's a right. That's not a privilege. That's a right, in my view. And we need to be able to create a space inside our community that allows for small businesses to survive and to thrive. And right now you see a sign up almost every day that says, I'm moving out here because they just tripled my rent. A small business cannot pay $100 per square foot and survive doing things that we need in our community. And that has to be seen as a right, just as medical, just like healthcare is a right, affordable housing is a right, and having small businesses that are taking care of the community and meeting the needs of the community are a right. We don't need 75,000 banks in one town.
So raise your hand and Charlotte will bring you the microphone. I want to point out that CCTV is set up in the hallway to actually have people sit down and tell their stories of the 60s so we can focus more on actual questions for the panelists and also get those stories on video forever. So thanks. Next question.
My name is Jeff Purcell. I've been in Cambridge for a long time, and I know Ken and Sandra and Bill. I'm lucky enough to have worked with them in the past and feel very fortunate. And Sandra said, be an activist, get known in your neighborhood. Well, I was an activist and got known in my neighborhood, and they said, Jeff, you need to be Our Revolution delegate to the convention. I said, okay, sign me up. And that's where I met Mike Connolly, Our Revolution. And he's the next generation. And he is, you can talk to him about socialism sometime, no problem. But I want to talk about the single worst thing that happened in Cambridge since I've been here. I used to be on the Cambridge Rent Board, and I knew some of the big landlords, you know, Steinberg, they had no problem with it because any expenses they got were passed on to the tenants. So the big landlords were not complaining about rent control. And it was some outside folks who tried to make examples that weren't really there to get rid of it. The first time around, Cambridge voted to keep it. Then it got statewide. All the cities voted to keep it. The rural areas voted to keep it. And the suburbs voted it out. So Cambridge has changed so much since then. In Parade magazine, they asked Matt Damon, when you go back to Cambridge, do you see your friends? He said, no, after rent control ended, they're all in Malden and Everett. And the people who noticed the end of rent control the most were the teachers, because so many of their students were gone, if you talk to the teachers. And I went to Harvard Law School. At some reunion, I was talking to a guy. He said, well, you know, I tried to be a good guy landlord, so I bought up a lot of rent control apartments to, you know, to be affordable apartments. But then they got rid of rent control, which I didn't want to do. So he made all his money, you know, for no reason, and he was not happy about it. So the worst thing that's happened to me in Cambridge is the end of rent control, and people are talking about the globalization of real estate, or you were talking about small businesses having to get, you know, compete with the global market. Well, you know, what's happening in Cambridge is apartments are being bought by big companies or overseas, Asian folks. That happened to Sandra Graham. She got outbid after she had already made a closing almost on her apartment because some big outfit came on and outbid her. That's sort of what's happening in Cambridge. So I think it's worth fighting for that, because as Bill gave a great history of the fight, and we need to be fighters. And I was at the American Constitutional Law Convention about a month ago. The last person to speak was the Gold Star parent Khan. Remember him? He got up there and said, this is the time we need people. And we were all lawyers there, particularly lawyers. It's time for you to stand up and you do something. This is a time in history when it counts. So we walked out of there, and Maura Healey was there too, and we walked out of there thinking it's time to do something. We didn't walk out of there depressed, and that was the message.
Hi, I'm Saul Tannenbaum. I want to build on something Carol said and want to talk about sort of the opposite side of the disconnect between sort of old Cambridge and new Cambridge. Some of the most radical action of the last decade happened in Cambridge, and I don't think anybody's really aware of that. It happens that Chelsea Manning, after she downloaded all the documents from the Army's secret network, came to Cambridge. She happens to love Cambridge. She thinks it's full of wonderful, nutty people. It was on her Facebook page, I'm quoting. Came to Cambridge, spent time in Cambridgeport, loving it, then went back overseas and gave all those documents to WikiLeaks. Turns out that the US government really cares what she was doing in Cambridge, and in particular wants to know what happened at the Oxford Spa on January 28th, 2010. There was a grand jury about this. There were Army criminal investigators crawling through Cambridge asking about this. There were FBI agents interviewing people, you know, at MIT and in the community. And it's just sort of completely unknown, and there was no community support for this. You know, something has really disconnected here where, I mean, a community of deep activism and tremendous stories and tremendous struggles, had something like this happen within its midst. And, you know, knowing what I know about the people who have publicly acknowledged being in contact with Chelsea Manning, yeah, she got tech support here in Cambridge. But we as a community didn't do anything to defend these people, and there were lives that were completely blown apart by this. I mean, just imagine, this was an espionage investigation. That's the most serious criminal investigation the government undertakes. It was happening in our midst, and nobody had any real idea.
Questions for the panelists?
I meant to phrase that in the form of a question.
Ah.
No, seriously.
Okay.
I mean, people were talking about the disconnect of the current sort of Cambridge community, you know, to the past of activism. I'm curious why the past of activism isn't connected to the current generation of radical action.
Who is up for that?
I'll take a stab at pieces. Well, you know, we have to acknowledge that Cambridge has changed. So I fell in love with Cambridge because I went to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and I was just overwhelmed by how many people were there whose parents and grandparents and therefore parents were all there. And I could have gotten an extra $10,000 and moved to California, but I really liked the rootedness of this place. Over the last 2 decades, the rootedness, we have people serving on the city council who don't even know the Cambridge I know at all. I mean, and that takes me out because it's such a important, wonderful, beautiful part. It used to be that you were activist, and then you were activist, and then you got to know the community, and then you ran for office, and then you lost, and then you came back, and you ran again, and finally got elected. That isn't necessarily the trend. So the connection between old Cambridge and new Cambridge is when the government doesn't even know half of Cambridge. That's a problem, in my opinion. Now, I'm 66 years old, so I won't have to suffer this too long. But my real thought is the rootedness of the place is changing, and I'm not quite sure what the new thing is. I had someone tell me that they could learn everything they needed to know about Cambridge in 2 days on the internet. The hubris of that is crazy making. But we elect that, so that's what we got. So my hope is that the rootedness and the connectedness, I mean, we don't have to be unconnected. We can reach out to one another. This is our ability. So I look at that. In some of the young activism, I love them. I'm just hoping, it's hard to me to be an activist without a great sense of history. And I worry, I stay up nights worrying about, you know, will people read enough so that they will understand what transpired? We're part of a continuum. We didn't just fall out the sky. So I guess I feel some real responsibility to be sitting on a panel here talking about what that past was, okay? And hopeful that these musings provide some bridges to the future for young people.
The other piece of that came with desegregation of the schools, where kids now have to go outside of their community to go to school. So when they come back to their community, they don't know people who live there because they're in another school system. Then you have the people of money who don't use the public school system, but they do use our daycare system. So they keep their kids in daycare, and then when they get of age to go to school, they're in private schools. So we never get to know who the kids are, who the parents are, because they don't participate. It's not that the older community doesn't welcome them. They just don't participate. They don't feel that these are their issues. They're very comfortable, and so they go on their merry way. You know, my street used to be loaded with kids. Now my street has my grandchildren and the people across the street. We have more dogs than we have people, than we have children, and that's the truth. We have more dogs than we have children in our community. And you can see them walking 2 and 3 dogs every single day, every day. You know, so it's like the new people who have moved in are just not interested in what is going on, and it's their community too. But they don't talk about it, they don't come out for it. We have meetings, they don't attend them. You know, so I mean, how do you get to those people when they don't come out and participate? And you don't know who they are. And then 2 years later, they're gone. And then there's a new people that come in. So every 2 years, our community changes. We don't know who they are. So I don't know how you get them to sit down and talk. The only time they come out is when there's adversity, when they think that you're degrading their house so that their taxes, you know, whatever. But they only come out when it's in their best interest and not in the community's interest. So we've tried to work that out, but it's just an ever-changing kind of situation. It's not a stable situation.
Here's our situation, folks. There's Toscanini's ice cream that's melting out in the hall. We are far from done with the way this panel should be going. But if anyone deserves that ice cream, it's the panelists. So can we do a final question? Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. I didn't even realize.
No problem. No.
But if you have a thought, like, let's get it out there.
Well, I just, because I've worked on a history of the city in the 20th century, you have to be a little bit more perspective about the changes that have happened over time. Of course, I'm sure that the changes are more dramatic in our time than they've ever been. But if you go back to 100 years ago, 50 years ago, you'll find that changes were taking place then. People were coming and going, and folks were worried about those changes. Of course, my worries are connected with the changes that affect me. I came here to work, and I worked in factories, and my whole way of looking at Cambridge was based on the Cambridge that I met with when I came here in 1960, 61. It has changed dramatically, but I think one of the most dramatic changes that we can take note of now is the ones that are brought about by changing technology. So, the Cambridge Chronicle, when I came here, it had a circulation of 25,000. People read the weekly newspaper that they put in front of them. There was a radio station right in Central Square that had a talk show that people called in from Cambridge and Somerville, right? When you went to the city council, you didn't have cameras. You had to go there if you wanted to see what was going on. And the councilor like Al Vellucci would wander around and do things that nobody can do anymore because you have to wear a suit and sit in front of the camera and address every single issue so the people are watching on TV know what's going on. There's a lot of things like this. You add them all up, and you get this strange feeling that you don't know anybody because everything is being mediated through these new methods. You sit in front of the computer, you think, oh, I'm going to be an activist, I'm going to sign a petition, boop, 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 and millions of people have signed this petition, and I'm one of them. But you don't know your neighbor, or know whether they've signed it or not. So, finally, I would observe that there's a little sweet part to the fact that some of the folks that are only here for a couple of years aren't interested in the community. I am kind of happy that they don't vote for city council because I live in public housing, and we're between the only, basically, you know, we that know the community, if you didn't buy your house 25, 30, 40 years ago, or if you don't live in subsidized housing, you're a very precarious situation if you're here at all. If the people who live in Cambridge and only vote in presidential elections now, if they voted in city council elections, they might be going, why are we subsidizing these people? Who are they? Why should we give them anything? There's this attitude that some people might have. I don't know whether they'll have those attitudes or not. I really don't know. But it behooves us, it behooves particularly the younger generation. If you want to be active, you got to find things that will bind together the interests of these folks so that there is, in fact, unity of interest among the newcomers and the old-timers. You've got to find those, and you also have to realize no matter how good your city councilor is, no matter how well-intentioned they are, no major initiative ever comes from government. It always comes from the people, and the government respond to it.
Okay. This is our last question for this round, a last good one. We need you with the microphone, otherwise CCTV can't get it.
What does the
There you go.
panel think about what we should do about the cost of housing in Cambridge?
About what?
Cost of housing in Cambridge.
I'll take a stab at that.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
Where's the
mic seems to have disappeared.
Up here.
Yeah.
Oh.
There you go.
Okay, so I mentioned that I'm having the pleasure of being in the Department of Architecture and Planning at MIT, and one of the reasons I'm there is to look at this question of how to build housing for people who are not millionaires. Now, I'm going to invite you to maybe get out of Cambridge Think, because this is not the only place that they have this housing crisis. It's an international problem. So they have it in London, and we certainly have it in California, we have it in Manhattan. This is an ugly thing. And there's some places in this country they don't have it. They don't have it in Atlanta. They don't have it in Texas. I brought together a group of developers I'm going to call them relatively conscious developers, to answer that question. What would it take in Cambridge? What if you were given land? What if the council was inclined to take these parking lots that become so popular and just figure out a way for us to collaboratively come up with a way to make housing? They said, even if you gave us the land, we couldn't build it because the cost of materials, because we're in competition with China and India and other places, prices are up. And the fact that nobody is going into construction, finding the people to do the work and having to pay them what they have to pay. We would not want the free land, we cannot do it. So that's a big conundrum for not just us, but it's international. Now, there are models in Scandinavia where 10, 15 families get together and they decide they're going to build something that they all going to live in, and they cut out the middleman. That's been interesting to study. But we really have a big question, because what we have now is a system that, like in London, 80% of what's built is available to only 20% of the people. So who in the hell built that system? And who does that benefit? And we have our version of that too, because these $2 million houses, I'm not going to buy one, you're not going to buy one. So, and why wouldn't we build a system that all the people like us can't come? Now, I'm too old for full revolution, but I do think there has to be some kind of upchuck of somebody saying, this does not make sense for us. And so we have to have our government intervene in ways. So, return of rent control, that's a discussion in California. But we have to say that this does not fit us. It doesn't benefit us, and we don't like it. So I'm waiting for that outrage to really come to the surface, because just decrying it, I want to say this too, the city council cannot fix this. It's bigger than the city council. So I think our city councils, the majority of them, work hard as hell and care, but that ain't enough, because it's a systemic problem that is wider than just commenting on. we really, nobody yet has come up with the answer to that question.
I think we're going to take a final thought from T. Grace. Is that right?
Yeah. I think one of the most important things is that everybody takes responsibility for what happens on the big scale and on the little scale too. And a lot of that comes from building communities where we are. When I moved here, I rent. All the houses around me, they were owned. And there was a division between if you rented or if you owned. Well, it seemed crazy to me. I walked over to my neighbors on every side and introduced myself and said, I'm your new neighbor. And people later said, well, you know, they own and you rent. I said, we all live here. I care how things look, that the garbage is picked up, that we keep things in a nice way, because this is where I come home. So the point is, we all live here. And making these connections, just starting where you live, then with the, as you are talking about that, you can talk about bigger issues. Well, what do you think about this? It's the communities and people being involved, everybody being involved. It's the only way we can change things. We all, we have to become the government. The city council, they try, but where are they getting pressure from? The big money. We have a problem, like in the dispute I was involved in, we had 100% participation. Nobody could believe it. We went to city council again and again and again. Made a big difference. In the end, the developer sold the buildings. And he tried to cry on my shoulder. He said it's been the worst experience of his life. I said I was really sorry to hear that. So that's what I have to say.
Let me say something about the cost of housing. First of all, housing hasn't been built on the market for anyone except the upper middle class since houses stopped being just boxes piled on top of each other and started getting electricity, water, toilets, all the stuff that makes housing more expensive. There used to be a thing called trickle down, which people made fun of. We made fun of trickle down because it's like, oh yeah, they build housing for middle class people, then the housing gets crappy and we can live in it. But in fact, that's the way it worked. And the reason it worked is that the buildings were only 2 or 3 stories high. People could modify them. Small landlords could buy and sell them. And they'd last a long time. Now everything that's built is high-rise. The per unit cost of the high-rise is a little bit less, but believe me, it's very expensive to keep them from falling down. The Housing Authority now is working on the Manning building, which is 19 stories high. That's like 3/4 of the whole budget that they have for renewing developments in the city now. Like $250 million to keep the damn thing from falling down. That's never going to trickle down. It's either going to have to be subsidized forever, or it's going to turn into stuff for wealthier people. So, for those who think that the high-rise is the solution to environmental and economic problems, I've got news for you. The reinsurance companies in Europe are saying that they're not going to reinsure high-rise developments anymore because of this very problem. There are so many of them in the world now, and they're going to be running into trouble, and it's not going to make sense to reinsure these places because most of them are not going to be able to be kept up in the long term. The second thing I have to say to you is rent control. The same thing that happens with medical expenses. If you don't control the expenses, you can subsidize all you want. The expenses just keep getting higher and higher. So you have the financial industry and the medical industry, the so-called industries, which weren't called industries in the old days, they were just businesses. But now, about almost 40% of the economy is between finance, which is mostly real estate, and medicine. So you've got to control these prices. Now tell me something, do you know that in 1960 70, when we were trying to get rent control, people said, you can never do that. You can't get rent control here. It's no good and you'll never get it. Well, you could never get it back because it ended in 1956. Most of the cities in the United States had rent control from 1941 to 1956. And guess what? Before that, they had rent control in the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge signed the first rent control law in Massachusetts in 1921. These same periods when there was rent control were the periods when, first of all, absentee landlords started selling their smaller properties, and so you had more home ownership. And there was development because rent control always exempts new construction. So the capital that would have gone in to speculating on existing structures went into building new construction instead. So it makes sense, but nobody wants to bring it up. Certainly nobody in politics wants to bring it up. And the organizations that I've been in, nobody wants to talk about it because it can't be done. We lost it. Well, that's not how you do politics, my friends. You don't lose once and then give up. You keep on fighting for what you need until you get it.
All right. And now it sounds silly to say it, but I'm sure we're in a serious ice cream crisis out there. Let's all reconvene back here in 5 minutes. Hopefully we're getting most or all of our panelists back, and we're going to hear from a new generation. There's a sign-up sheet out there, and Christina Carrere from CCTV is out there to get 1960s stories. So, get ice cream, eat it out in the hall, come back in 5 minutes. Our new generations of activists, some of the best and the brightest young activists. We're going to talk with them about what they're doing and how the 1960s informs what they're doing. Mary Gashaw recently graduated from Cambridge Ringen Latin School, student member of the school committee and an organizer at one time with Black Lives Matter Cambridge, where she memorably was chained to the front doors of the City Hall during a housing protest. Clara Ingersoll was inspired to learn about feminist and anti-racist theory after going to punk shows during her first year at CRLS. Because there wasn't a place for students to discuss these issues at the school, she started the CRLS Feminist Club, Club 1, her sophomore year, helped pressure the school to change a dress code that targeted curvy women, women of color, and lower class women, and the following year, Club 1 led a school-wide walkout and presented the administration with a letter of demand signed by hundreds of students calling for changes to school trainings, programs, culture, policy, and protocol to be in accordance with Title IX law. In addition, she drew national attention for co-founding OK Mag and launched the Laptop Project to help bridge the high school digital divide. Mike Connolly is now state representative for Cambridge and Somerville in the 26th Middlesex District, but began his political life 6 years ago as an attorney for Occupy Boston. Since then, he successfully nudged Cambridge to go net zero on greenhouse gas emissions on its buildings and has led the conversation on housing issues as well, including as an aide for Councillor Dennis Carlone. He's been called the first occupier to take public office and part of a wave of Bernie-crats taking office that could be transformative to U.S. politics. Welcome, guys. My question for you is basically, how have you come to do what you do? What was the radicalizing moment for each of you when so many people are fairly happy to live their lives not, well, as they say, signing a digital petition and letting it go at that? And after that, I'm wondering if you'll address to what degree you and your fellow activists are following a playbook of techniques honed in the 60s, and to what degree it works or does not work. And we can circle back around, but I want to find out your radicalizing moment. And we can start with Mike. Green light? There's always one.
Hello, I think it works. Maybe, yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's really been an inspiring and really just meaningful conversation for me as an activist and as someone in the community. You know, I think to your question of, you know, how did I get radicalized, assuming that I'm radicalized, I grew up in public housing in Norwood, Massachusetts, and really from a young age it was instilled in me that the Democratic Party would be the party that would fight for anyone who was in need or anyone who needed assistance or support in life. And really, to make a long story short, by time I reached law school and, as the Bill Clinton era went into the George W. Bush era, went into the Barack Obama era, I really started to doubt that Democratic Party that I was told about as a kid was really the Democratic Party of today. And so for me, around the year 2011 or so, I started looking at everything that was happening in Washington, D.C., these budget showdowns, the sequester and all that stuff. And I started looking at government and just started thinking, I look at the political realm and I'm not seeing the action taken on the things that we need, and I'm starting to think, why couldn't I just get involved and try doing this myself? And that was really my initial thought. So when the Occupy movement happened, I was pretty much ready for something. I was ready for something that really spoke to me, and when the Occupy movement happened, particularly with the focus on income inequality and on the corruption of the political system, I was ready, and I was like, all right, I want to be there. And so that was sort of the turning point for me, where I went from someone who read the newspaper or watched MSNBC and just sort of had thoughts that I shared with my friends, to being like, okay, I want to be someone who's actually in the street, I want to be in the community, I want to be working with other people, trying to make a difference. And so Occupy came and went, it was certainly a learning experience, and then from there, it was actually at Occupy I started meeting sort of more radical people from Cambridge who started, turning me on to different issues here in our community around things like affordable housing. So really the first issue that I really dug into was when MIT was seeking rezoning for its Kendall Square initiative. And I took a look at that and I thought, okay, MIT wants to use some of its land to build commercial offices, commercial lab space, that's fine. But what is MIT doing about its own graduate students and the need to house thousands of graduate students who are out on the private market? And so I sort of engaged with the city council, with groups like the Cambridge Residents Alliance, calling for that graduate student housing. We didn't really win nearly what we were asking for in that MIT debate like 5 or 6 years ago. But to Bill Cunningham's point, which I thought was really important, just because you try to do something and you get told no and you don't get everything you want, you have to come back the next day, the next week, and the next month, the next year, and just keep asking and keep trying and keep pushing. And it was sort of through that activist process that I started getting more involved with politics. I ran for office, lost, I ran again, lost again, and then I finally ran a third time and I won. And so certainly I think a huge takeaway for all of us in this generation is that, it's going to be a pound of effort for an ounce of results, is pretty much the saying that I've come up with when it comes to activism. It's going to be a lot of work just to make a little progress. And so I guess that's a little bit. I'll stop there and interested to hear what others have to say on it.
Good afternoon. We're going to do that again. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah, now I know you're awake. Hi, my name is Marika Shah. And my origin story of organizing comes from where I'm originally from. I'm from Ethiopia. My family, we immigrated here when I was pretty young, like 6 months. So I've been in Cambridge for a very, very long time in that regard. I grew up with my father being a political organizer and always talking about what was happening back home in Ethiopia. There's a lot of political corruption that happened when I was younger, but it's still continuing to happen today. And so we had come to this country, my father in particular, with a strong message of, in America, you have freedom of speech, you have the ability to say what you want to say, and fight for folks who don't have a voice. So when I was about 5 years old, I was like a daddy's girl, and so I was always listening to his press conferences, to the cell phone conferences and going to the meetings, and he was like, you know what, you should just do a speech. And so within the Ethiopian community, I was about 5 years old, and I gave a speech about the injustices that were happening to Ethiopians back home. And from then on, fighting for folks who don't have a voice and speaking out against injustice became a part of my duty as a human being. And from then on, when I saw an issue, when I saw a problem, I would speak up. And so when Cambridge School Committee decided that they wanted to make the K to 8 go K to 6, go K to 5 and 6 to 8, I spoke out against that. When they wanted to get rid of the intensive studies program, I spoke out against that. And continue to do so and take in that leadership role as a student in the Cambridge Public Schools. One of the turning points in recent history was the murder of Mike Brown. And it's important to bring his name into every space that I'm in because he's one of the reasons why the Black Lives Matter movement gained so much momentum. Because black bodies being murdered by police officers is an injustice. Black bodies not being able to get access to health care, housing, quality education is a problem. And when I realized that as a sophomore in high school, I felt the need to say something, to do something, because Cambridge Region Latin wasn't creating a space for black people to feel safe and to feel heard and validated. And so we walked out. And that was one of the first walkouts that happened in a couple of years at the high school. It was the first protest for many of my peers. We shut down Harvard Square along with the law students and the other folks, and that gained national and international attention. And then from that moment, a group of organizers, y'all might know Tony B, Stephanie Grand, and so on, got together and like, we need to make sure that Black Lives Matter in Cambridge. I told them they needed my help because in every movement that we've had, young people have been at the forefront and have led and made sure that we have won. And so I joined them in January of 2015, and from then on, we continued to lead actions and events to bring up the fact that Black lives do matter. Yeah, and I'm gonna just stop there because I can keep going on forever.
I'm Clara, and the walkout that Mary just mentioned, that was something I was going to mention. That was probably one of the most, I think not the first, but one of the most powerful and definitely an awakening moment for me, and a moment where I realized that I definitely wanted to be speaking out publicly and to be owning the issues that I cared about in a space and working with other people around me. And in my school, in Cambridge Region Latin. I also want to give kind of credit or just mention that I went to the Graham Park School, Sandra Graham, it's what our school is named for, and Rosa Parks. And there I took the Facing History and Ourselves curriculum, which was a really powerful curriculum that focused on genocide and mass violence, as well as the power of kind of the bystander in allowing for mass violence to happen. And we did monologues and things like that, getting ourselves into places, into the perspective of immigrants, whether it's someone in your family. I wrote a monologue for my bubby who immigrated here with my mom out of Soviet Czechoslovakia. And we also got into characters of upstanders in the Holocaust and studied a lot of other genocides and folks that stood up against kind of the general trend. So that was definitely a really important education for me. And then there were a lot of teachers at Cambridge Region Latin that really pushed that curriculum and really supported students to speak up in the classroom and to critique what was, the trends and the issues at our school. And to generally like speak in class, because there's a lot of issues with certain people not speaking, and we can go into this in a bit, but definitely a lot of these issues run deep at Cambridge Region Latin, like Mary said. So there were a lot of teachers that supported me there and supported a lot of students there to be louder about those things. And then I guess going to punk shows, Mark mentioned that was definitely really important for me, getting into more feminist theory, reading like zines and listening to loud music and getting angry and wanting to do something and feeling like I had a community that really agreed with me. So yeah, that would be my answer.
I want to do one quick round with the new generation, and then we get to sort of include the 1960s activists back into the mix. But can you tell us to what degree, I mean, think of, in our modern era of protest, I think of the 60s, the 90s, and today, basically. Do the protests of today, do your organizing, do your efforts look back, no, I'm sorry, I'm talking to, do your efforts look back at what you know of what the protests included in the 1960s? Do you consciously follow, do your organizations consciously follow what we know as the playbook that we inherited from the 1960s?
Okay. In most Black Lives Matter protests, we always bring in Assata Shakur, who was a freedom fighter and is one of our ancestors that we like, who is still alive, but is one of the elders that we want to always bring into the space because of her revolutionary spirit, but also because of the intersectionality of the movements in the 1960s. I always think about, when we think about the 1960s, at least the way we're taught in high schools, there's the Martin and there's the Malcolm. People don't talk about Ella Baker. People don't talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. People don't talk about Diana Nash. They don't talk about the women who actually led the movements behind the doors, and the intersectionality that existed there and the power behind that. And so when Black Lives Matter speaks about Black Lives Mattering, there's a clear belief in the intersectionality, that we have to talk about all Black lives. We have to talk about the trans lives. We have to talk about Black women's lives. And that clear intersectionality from the 60s, but then also remembering that the people are the target, that when we organize and that when we fight, it's not necessarily to fight to get new people elected into office, it's to build the consciousness and the pride of the people, because like we all say, all power to the people, and that's a saying that we keep because the people are the target. If we want to make change and build strong movements, we have to remember that the people are those who carry the power in the movements. And one of the last lessons that I always find powerful from the 60s is the power of direct action and the power of the human body and the way that it can be used in so many different ways. When we decided to chain ourselves to City Hall, it was we were very intentional that we wanted 2 Black women chained by the neck to the doors, with 2 white men also being connected to us, to show that there's the power of solidarity, but also the physical, the visual of 2 Black women's necks, like it looked like we were being hung. And the way that the visuals and the way that people in the 60s were very particular with the way that they wanted the media to see what was being done, the way that direct actions were being done.
Yeah, to build on that, in starting the feminist club at CRLS, I was really hoping that we could combine like the solidarity, consciousness raising sort of model, but also having some meetings that were focused around like solidarity and sharing experiences, shared experiences, and coming together and supporting each other and feeling not alone in those ways, and also building a community there. And building a community with teachers and other adults in the community that agreed and wanted to support, but also making a difference by planning actions, also having conversations open to other people that may not agree with us. Obviously those meetings aren't every week, and that's pretty exhausting, but having some spaces for that dialogue and also planning ways to have a wider dialogue was definitely, that was kind of like a dichotomy that I thought between and that a lot of us in the club dealt with and kind of were confused about and definitely struggled with that. But I feel like we definitely did in some way maintain a balance between those 2 things, and I think those are really important. And you know, the first part of building a movement is building solidarity and getting a community together and feeling connected and loving each other to move forward in that. So that was a lesson, I guess, from a lot of early anti-racist and feminist organizing that we learned. And then like Mary said, a walkout. We were inspired by the Hands Up, Don't Shoot walkout, which was inspired by a lot of the civil rights walkouts. So that's, again, like a direct connection. And then speaking, we wanted to, I think this definitely happened a lot in the 60s, we wanted to have direct quotes from folks that had experienced sexual violence at Cambridge Rindge and Latin, being held up and being very visible, so that these stories that are often, people are silent about these things, they're ashamed, they cause a lot of folks to, it's really hard to talk about these things basically because you can, they come with a lot of emotion and a lot of pain and a lot of shame, so making those experiences very loud and very public was a really conscious tactic that we all did because it's really easy for us to say that these things don't happen, and so we wanted to make them super visible and force everyone to read them. Yeah, that's my answer.
I just wanted to add one more thing. A lot of the work that was done in the 60s, people communicated, even though they were focusing on different issues, there was a lot of communication and work happening. And so while Clara was focusing a lot on feminism and I was focusing a lot on anti-racism work, we were always in communication and dialogue with each other, and that relationship existed, and that's one of the other lessons that we...
So I've often felt that I wish maybe I was around in the 1960s. I think I would have fit right in. So I'm sorry that I was born in 1980, but for me as an activist, and for me as now a state representative in our community, I am just always hungry for whatever history, whatever connection, whatever learning that I can do from what's come before. One of the first things I did when I moved to Cambridge, and I moved to Harding Street, which is sort of in between Inman Square and East Cambridge, is I went to a local bookstore and I bought All in the Same Boat, which is the story of East Cambridge, and I read that book a couple of times. I went out and I got a few other history books, some great books produced about the history of mid-Cambridge and things that have happened in Central Square, and have always just tried to want to understand, okay, I live in this place, I spend all my time in this place, what has happened here? And there's so much to learn, and there's so much to appreciate. It's one of the reasons why, I'm so grateful for the work that Mark Levy does here with Cambridge Day, really, chronicling, what it is that happens in our city. There's also, if you're ever curious about what had happened, the Harvard Crimson has a wonderful archive online where, I've learned about things that Sandra Graham and other people have done, because you can read stories from the 1960s or the 1970s when people in this community were fighting for things like rent control or fighting to get a sense of what Harvard's intentions were. And I think we can learn a lot from that history. So that would sort of be my point, is I do think it is incredibly important for us as activists today to really understand the history that has come before and to continue trying to contribute to it.
In light of what I think is a lack of resonance of the Occupy movement compared with what we still think of as the work of the 1960s, was there something that changed there? Was there something that got missed?
I think the Occupy movement, there were so many issues all being trying to be hashed out in one location, in one time. So, I don't think it necessarily missed it. I think it was just a moment in time, and I think that in many ways some of the other movements that are doing so well right now, hopefully are just continuing some of that spirit of activism that was present for a brief moment of time with the Occupy movement. I mean, I think if you look at Bernie Sanders and the success that he had as a presidential candidate, I mean, I saw him sort of as the Occupy candidate. He was saying things, and I think someone else mentioned this earlier, he was saying things that 5-10 years ago were just completely off the radar. And now even Donald Trump talks about wealth inequality. I mean, he's full of it, and everything he says is a lie, and I don't believe anything he says. But even, people on the right will acknowledge that we have inequality. Well, before Occupy happened, inequality was not really at the forefront the way it ought to be. So I guess, yeah, that would be my answer.
In this last segment, I'm excited to bring activists from the 1960s back into the dialogue. And there's the potential for conflict here, but that is not my intent. But we happen to have...
Where there is no struggle, there is no progress. Frederick Douglass.
We happen to have a state rep with a strong focus on housing, and we have housing advocates. We have someone who has worked and has been identified with Black Lives Matter, and we have a co-chapter head of the NAACP. And we have two feminists of different eras sitting side by side. And I could not pass up the opportunity to have a dialogue between these generations in our last few moments. And I thought maybe we'd start with the feminists. Claire, when you look back at a struggle that T. Grace didn't start in the 1960s, but had a strong role in, what do you take from that? And T. Grace, when you look at where feminism is now, has it gone astray? Did it build on what you did? I'm hoping that you can both sort of look forward and look back and find some sort of a nexus there. And I leave it up to you who starts.
Well, the way you posed it is problematic, but...
We can repose it.
My own view is that we made very little progress. There was some awareness, a shared awareness of pain. But if you think we're half the population, that means unless you make change that all women benefit from, no women really are secure in any kind of progress. So I think that we have to, because of our sheer numbers, I think we have to dig down really deep as far as what kind of change will benefit women. And I think things like equal distribution of income for every individual, not for every family, for every women are people too. For every individual. That would help, that would solve a lot of problems. Because when you have your own means of survival, you don't have to take shit from anybody. And they're not dishing it out as much either. So these issues, I don't think we didn't dig far enough. And I think that well, look at abortion. How secure is that? I mean, it's, and in terms of equal pay, if you look at income inequality, whatever gains, there's a way you can look at it, that whatever gains women made, who lost? And they weren't the people who were profiting the most to begin with. So I think that neither the earlier movement and from what I'm aware of in the current, they're not looking at those kinds of issues that are necessary to free everybody. And women are on the bottom, so the bright news is solve our problems and everybody's going to be better off, but not everybody sees it that way.
Yeah, I guess specifically looking at, with regards to what I'm speaking on this panel for, I think that the dress code and Title IX policies in institutions and schools all over the country and all over the world, they don't have Title IX, but I was just studying in Canada, and my school didn't even have a sexual harassment or assault policy in place. So I think this is definitely an issue that, and the violence against women is a huge issue. There's a huge epidemic of rape on campuses and generally in society, and it's extremely underreported, extremely, the conversation around it is extremely stigmatized. There's a huge kind of conception that folks are lying about these things when statistics show that actually under 5% of rape accusations are in any way not completely factual. So I would say that in this specific area, and specifically at Cambridge Rindge and Latin, which I think a lot of people hold to be as an example for other institutions, we had a huge problem with victim blaming in a lot of our policies, and not just policies targeting women, targeting students of color as well. If people are being objectified, if people are being sexualized, and if people are being harassed and assaulted, why are you blaming and why are you burdening those people? Why aren't you making the processes of them reporting comfortable and safe for them? Why aren't you encouraging them to report that? Why aren't you supporting those people? We are not only putting the burden of trying to have these conversations on those people, but also the people that are, when people are experiencing those things, we aren't supporting them, and our policies don't reflect support, and also don't even reflect national law. Our policies in place weren't even in accordance with Title IX, so that's just not legal. It's not radical for us to be calling for that to be in place. That's literally, our school was not following the national law, so we shouldn't have been getting the funding because we weren't following the rules to be a school. So I think these are issues that take new faces, and the conversations change around them. But I think a lot of these problems are still, a lot of the problems and a lot of the ways people are thinking about them and speaking about them, blaming victims, blaming oppressed people, blaming women. This is something that our society loves to do, and I don't really see that. I think it's changing in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people are speaking out about it, and I feel really hopeful for the conversations around it right now. But I also, it's such this problem runs so deeply, psychologically also runs so deeply. Women and femme people shrink themselves so much, don't speak up, end their sentences, they're not confident when they're saying really brilliant stuff. I do this myself, and there are so many ways that we are shrinking ourselves and that we're not calling out the things that we know are there, and there's so many women that are dealing with so many other forms of oppression, and there's so many women that aren't willing to look at different forms of oppression and willing to work with other women, and so I think these are issues that these were issues that existed in the 60s, and the issues that very much exist today.
And what's your final thoughts? Sandra?
I'd just like to ask a question, because it has really bothered me. President Obama said, "We are the change." What did he mean by that? I haven't seen the change. In fact, I think we're going backwards myself. But what did he mean by that? When 2 years later, we lost the House and the Senate. So we had a Republican Congress and a Democratic president that couldn't get anything done once it became Republican. They vowed to stop him at every single turn, and they did. So that we didn't get the good legislation that I thought President Obama was going to put before the Congress to get voted on. So for what, 6 years? We have been standing still, absolutely standing still. We haven't progressed on any level. And the whole issue around health care, oh my God, that is traumatic. How can you leave a country of 33 million people uninsured, knowing what the cost of health care is? How can you vote on something like that? So I like to ask the question, we are the change? I don't think so, because a lot of people did not vote in that second election that was the Senators and the Republicans election. And we lost. And we are still losing. And we are fighting to survive. You know, you got a president in office that is absolutely cruel. He is a monster. And he doesn't care. You see the way he treats his own administration. He just keeps firing them when they don't agree with him. And I'll bet you Kelly will be the next one to go. But how do we combat that? What do we do to combat that? How can we get what we need for the people?
So I really appreciate the question, and I figured I'd take a stab at it, even though it's a very difficult one. And for me, it comes down to this word neoliberalism, which, you know, I believe is unfortunately the ideology of our times. And it's an ideology that's been adopted, you know, not just by the Republican Party, but by the Democratic Party. And by neoliberalism, I mean austerity budgets at the federal level and the state level. I'm talking about privatization of public services. I'm talking about the financialization of so many services. You know, instead of us saying we need to maintain our public housing, let's just tax rich people and build public housing. Now it's all very complicated, financialized instruments that involve Wall Street, and along the way, we really lose the opportunity to help people. And so for me, you know, sort of, and we heard that a little bit earlier on the other panel on how, you know, in some areas, even though we've made nowhere near enough progress, at least in some areas to do with race and perhaps to do with peace and with war and peace, we've made some progress. But then when you look at the economic picture, it's clear that we've actually gone backwards from the 1960s. And I would attribute it to that neoliberalism, to a lot of the decisions made by Bill Clinton in the 1990s to attach the Democratic Party to Wall Street, basically providing us with no other option between economic policies. And, you know, I think the thing to consider is, you know, the ideology that Bernie Sanders promoted, which is democratic socialism, and considering how do we leverage common resources to address all of our common needs.
Confession is good for the soul.
Can we get another microphone?
Confession is good for the soul. So I'm a Bernie man too, and I think something real happened in that election, which is I had a Bernie meetup at my house, and they said, "Well, how many people do you want to have?" And I said, "Well, maybe we could hold 50." I had 100-something people at my house. They came out, and it was a snowy Saturday. I mean, it was like anybody else wouldn't have been coming. So I believe deep down in America that we know there is more there than we see nationally. There's some good things about having more decades than others, and that you have seen some things. I too have to scratch myself about 8 years of Clinton and 8 years of Obama. And so I'm in the airport the other day, and somebody has a t-shirt that says, "Hope was a dream." And I thought, well, that's something. That must have been a dream, because the hope that the Obamas were going to bring us, maybe you have it, but I don't necessarily have it. But I am clear about big change has happened. And I'll just give a couple examples. So I told you about the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which I loved, and I was there for 37 years. And then me and they and the question of who I might be was a little of an issue. So I had to tip over to a rich white Episcopal church where at least I could be who I am. So at the rich white Episcopal church, I'm looking at, they have these wonderful displays of history. And there's a postcard in this display case that is a postcard that the minister sent to all of the members of the church to determine, one, whether or not women could vote for who's going to be on the vestry, that's the governing body, and two, whether or not women could run for vestry. This postcard is dated 1955. So, trust me, something has happened. Something has happened. And last week I went to a beautiful author meeting with a woman named Kachanga Ochi, who's been visiting here from Nigeria, who's written a wonderful set of short stories about women in Nigeria, expatriate women and Nigerian women. And at the talk part, I said, the one thing that struck me is that the women in every one of your short stories are not equal to men at all. So that's a different world. Now, I think it was Mr. Cunningham said this. I'm a child of the 60s. I'm a gay man. It never occurred to me in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s that I'd ever be a black gay man married to a man in Cambridge. That's change. That's very real change, an unimagined change. So I believe there has been change. Now where we're going is something, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Black Lives and also Occupy, because at some point you become able to be an observer as opposed to having to lead anything. So with Occupy, I know Occupy Cambridge. Occupy Cambridge was in Harvard Yard. And I thought to myself, it's very interesting because Harvard has a history of springtime protests. And the history of it is this. The administration knows if you are protesting in April and May, the commencement is going to come and they have to have the yard back because they have to have commencement. And so they outweight you. And they know you're not going to be there in the summer. And they know that the next crop of people in September, so they simply ignore you. That I knew. If somebody had asked me, I would have said, don't occupy now, occupy in September. Be a pain. They know, May, please. They know you. So if anybody had asked me that, I would have told them. But what's interesting, I want to know more about what the specific objectives of movements are. I love Black Lives Matter because there's energy that it's important. I mean, all these black men being killed by the cops, and everybody's just wringing their hands. And 3 black women get together and say, Black Lives Matter. Profound. But now I want to better understand, so what is the direction of those 3 words? And I must say, I don't know. And unfortunately, you had a wonderful full-day thing at Leslie that was also the rain date for Hoops and Help. So I was kind of divided. But I would love to know more where these movements want to go.
Hello again. I've been getting a lot of phone calls because of what happened in the past, 70s, 60s, 80s. The school department called me up and said they wanted to have a workshop. So I think that one of the good ideas is the teachers realize that they have to do something different in education. They asked me, and I said, there's 4 people, and it's funny, the 4 of us are sitting on the panel here. So we've been getting called, all of us, Black Lives Matter. We spoke to the kids in the 5th, 6th grade. And it was such a wonderful experience. We were there for 3 hours. The kids asked a lot of questions about everything. And so I think that's one of the ways to go, because I said, why are they calling me up at this time? They want me to know what happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But it's important about history for these kids, so these kids can learn what's going on, because they might not hear about this at home. So I think it's by every time we get called up. Also, I got a call to the Black National Lawyers Guild. They want me to come and speak in conferences. And this jail thing happened like 20 years ago, but they want me to speak at conferences about the horrors of grand jury abuse and how you're sitting there with 18 people and you can go to jail for 18 years and keep going on and going on. But luckily I happened to get out in a grumbles motion, which is a special motion, along with the community support. It had to be both. It couldn't just be the grumbles motion, which is allowed to people who have to go to jail first to even get a grumbles motion. But fortunate for me, I stopped because I went to jail and fought them. The grumbles motion stopped. I mean, I used the grumbles motion, but the grand jury stopped. They didn't call any more people in. They figured they didn't want to deal with any more Carroll Hills. But anyways, I think by the school department recognizing that people need to come in and talk to the youth, that's an important thing that's happening. So I keep calling Sandra up, Sandra, they want you to speak. But thank you for participating and coming, hoping, tell the young people, they have to do, because a lot of people are so interested in their own personal life. That to be an activist, you have to be a special person. There's no doubt about it. You have to be a special person, because it's another job. And you're taking care of your own life, and then you got to raise your children and take care of your husband. So it's not an easy job being an activist. I thank you.
To even roughly adhere to my commitments to the library, we need to be thinking about final statements as we're talking right now. We're a little bit over time. Oh, no, absolutely. Please answer the question. I'm just saying, as you answer it, keep in
I have
mind.
a final statement in mind. So the answer Ken Reeves' question, Black Lives Matter, in addition to many other organizations focusing on anti-racism, did come out with a policy platform. It's called the Movement for Black Lives Policy Platform, and it touches on 6 main important points: ending the war on black people, reparations, invest, divest, economic justice, community control, and political power. And so a lot of the demands range from freeing political prisoners like Mumia Abu-Jamal, making sure that the local police or policing people don't have, aren't militarized. So like Cambridge, for example, has military vehicles, and making sure that police don't have that power. Investing in job programs so black people are able to get jobs, making sure that we have universal health care that is free and accessible for all. And so there is a policy platform. If you Google Movement for Black Lives Policy Platform, it exists. And that's part of the work that is being done. There are folks who are actively working on making those demands in that policy happen. What I want to say personally is that there's a question that I've been thinking about a lot, and that is, how free are we supposed to be if we don't know how free we are supposed to be? And the reason why I've been thinking a lot about that question is because growing up in the Obama era and having so much hope and faith that this politician will create change for me, that has been a lie. It's been false. That didn't happen at all. And so now I'm having the mindset that I can't rely on these politicians. I can't rely on the government to make the change that I want to see. And so when we talk about housing and the problem with housing, there's a lot of vacant housing in Cambridge, right? And there are families who need housing right now. What would it look like for us to not rely on city council members or developers to create housing, and if we just went and took that housing and gave it to the people that needed it, right? What would it look like if we stopped waiting for politicians to do their job and we just did what we wanted to do and what we knew was right? What if we started living in the alternative world, a post-oppression world that we want to see, rather than waiting for people to create that world for us? And so I've been struggling with that, because for me, I want to be free now. And I know that freedom is possible right now. It's a matter of what community members who wants to join in this freedom at this very moment and is willing to say fuck you to all the politicians, to all the people who are getting in our way, because there's bureaucracy, there's a process, there's this, there's that. Because freedom is possible right now. It's a matter of truly believing in it and demanding and getting it.
With regards to sexual violence, I think there's kind of a similar undertone with my hope for the future, which is that we can have community accountability around these issues. It's been proven that we can't address, basically the justice system does not fight or deal with sexual violence, rape culture, like in any way that is positive for kind of anyone involved. We need rehabilitative justice in this area, like more than anything, and that's just not what we have in the United States of America at all. And so, like moving forward, it's really like it really is up to communities. It really is up to you and your relationships to the people around you, holding them accountable, educating your children around these issues, teaching them to respect consent, to respect how people present themselves, teaching your children that they can, and your friends and everyone around you and your parents and your grandparents, that they can present themselves in any way they want, and then how the people treating them with violence is not their fault. And it's your responsibility to speak up when you can, and to support survivors and victims of harassment and assault and rape, and generally like existing in a culture which is objectifying them. It's your responsibility, and you can make a huge difference. And it really like starts with like speaking to people around you and like creating that culture of accountability and creating that culture of support and expectations. And you can create those expectations just by letting people around you know what you expect and what you will do for folks that are suffering from these like very real issues. So I guess just like you can really create that community around you, and you can create that accountability and practice that.
So final comment, is that what this is?
That's about where we are.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do. I mean, that's really all there is to say. Donald Trump is in the White House. It's really almost unbelievable, but every day we wake up, he's still there. So I guess he's 1/8 of the way through his term. So we have at least 7/8 of it to go. He can't get reelected. Nationally, we talked a little bit about the Democratic Party and about Obama. If you think about the legacy of the Obama years, one of the legacies is 1,000 Democrats have essentially lost their seats in state legislatures, in Congress, and in governors and things like that. So what we've seen is an absolute collapse of the Democratic Party, which culminated with Donald Trump winning the presidency on November 8th. And so certainly from my perspective as a newly elected member who's part of the Democratic Party and representing us on Beacon Hill, I'm interested in transformation. I mean, I'm certainly not comfortable with the status quo, and I think that really has to be our work, and it has to be all of us working together. And again, it's that pound of effort will get us an ounce of results. So we're just going to have to make tons of effort to make the change we need.
I wish so much that we had more time. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry, that definitely deserves. Thank you especially to our panelists for everything that they have done and continue to do. Thank everyone to being here for this panel and all the panels and taking part. We will update the Facebook event page when we know more about when CCTV will broadcast this event. Thanks to Toscanini's, the Middle East, CCTV, the Public Library, and to our participants, to Haley Heeman and Charlotte Somerville. And please keep in mind, if you have stories of the 1960s to tell, again, Christina Carrere is here to take them, and CCTV is welcoming people with stories into their studio in Central Square for a recording session 4 to 7 p.m. Wednesday, August 2nd. And we were playing some songs from the 1960s earlier, but I'm going to send you off with my favorite protest song from the 1990s or the 2000s, Le Tigre's New Kicks. Thank you all for coming.